Hi everyone, please subscribe to my channel. Blood Immortal. See playlist for other chapters and novels. Join now our Telegram channel now and enjoy exclusive early access. t.me/blood_immortal_official. I do not translate the novels. Credits goes to original translator and author of the novel. I only make it as an audiobook so it would be easier to just listen while doing other things. Credits goes to the author of the novel. I convert stories to audiobook for mental health, for multitasking purpose, for accessibility and time saving. Listening to audiobook is also beneficial for people who have disability. It improves our listening skills and improve our English comprehension, vocabulary and other things. So, thank you for listening. Thank you and thank you very much for your support. Chapter 101. Hephaestus's works are numerous. Hermes's winged sandals that Yuan had coveted, the shield of Medusa that Athena had, and the sun chariot of Ares were all his works. However, if you had to pick one of the greatest masterpieces he had created, everyone would say the same thing. It was Zeus's thunderbolt. The materials of the quinine and the trident may be similar, but it wasn't made by the uncle. Hephaestus was the greatest blacksmith of Olympus. No, of this tower. The thunderbolt of Zeus that he had created had truly fearsome power. If you swung the thunderbolt once, an entire island would disappear, and it was an item that could manipulate the weather in the sky with one's will. That was the thunderbolt. Tisk, tisk, tisk. Quinine's eyes began to widen. The hand that held quinine began to tremble. Swaa. Waves of mana poured out through his eyes as if it was about to explode. It seemed like his right hand would be torn apart at any moment as he tried to control it. The quinine of Hades was made by one of Hephaestus's disciples. Tisk, tisk, tisk. There were less than 10 blacksmiths who could handle adamantium even after searching the entire tower. And even among those 10, the skill in handling adamantium was again divided. Adamantium was the only material that could transfer the power of the black divine stone, the sea divine stone, and the sky divine stone. Depending on how skillfully it was handled, the performance of the item would vary greatly. So this quinine, tisk, tisk, kwaak. Yuan grabbed quinine, whose eyes were wide open, and began to walk forward again. It's much better than what that Hades guy had. Thud, thud. Growl, growl, kya. As Yuan approached, the monsters crouched down and bared their teeth threateningly. However, not a single one of them rushed forward. No, rather, it was the opposite. Swish, swoosh. One by one, the monsters began to part to the left and right. They were like small herbivores in front of a ferocious beast. Eek, squeak, eek. Some of the monsters completely prostrated themselves and let out painful groans. Yuan did nothing. He was just pulling up the power of quinine as much as he could. Halfway there, thud, Yuan took a step toward the sea divine stone. He was in a hurry, but he couldn't show it. Those who possess absolute power should always be relaxed. Those monsters that relied on numbers would rush at Yuan again if they saw him getting impatient or showing an opening. That's why Yuan didn't hurry. One step at a time, slowly. He just walked through the gap between the monsters that were parting ways and making way for him. However, Wang, Waa, the sea divine stone embedded in the mana heart of the sea turtle began to glow. Tisk, Yuan clicked his tongue once and quickened his pace. Bam, Yuan, who had instantly jumped up, ran straight toward the sea divine stone. The moment he used Hermes's winged sandals to instantly have the distance again. Kya, numerous monsters that had been split to the left and right until now rushed at Yuan once again. If you had just stayed still, you wouldn't have died. Kwaak. Yuan clenched his hand and pointed his sword at the wave of monsters that were flooding in like a wave. It seems like you're pretty stubborn, rushing in even though you know you'll die. Chi, chi, chi. Quinine's eyes glowed, black mana spewed out through his eyes. The mana that was no longer being controlled flowed along Yuan's sword. The next moment, flash, along with Yuan's word, Quincy's a magical power to the surrounding area. Roar, zap. The monsters charging from the front disappeared completely along the path Yuan was going. The monsters disappeared along these words range. It looked as if they were being devoured by something enormous. Hundreds of monsters disappeared in a flash. However, the path was not yet fully cleared. Not yet. Wince, sizzle. Yuan felt Quincy's cold grip being ripped apart. It was because of the excessive flow of mana that his body couldn't handle. Just 2 more times. He didn't feel comfortable relying on an item like Quincy to exert such overwhelming power. Especially since he was currently struggling to withstand his own power and his body was creaking. However, he had to hold on for at least 2 more times. Crackle. The power emanating from Quincy grew stronger once again. Another follow-up attack. Slash. As if drawing a large line on a canvas with a brush, a wide path was created again in the middle of the wave of monsters blocking Yuan's view, along the path of his sword. Sizzle. His grip was torn again. It felt like his hand was about to burst open at any moment. Is it still not enough? The skill inherent in Quincy, hell. No, it couldn't be called a skill, it was more like a phenomenon. That had opened on the back of his glove was like a door. No one, not even Yuan, knew where it led to or what kind of place it was. However, it was clear that an enormous power that Yuan couldn't fathom was flowing within. I should be able to swing it once more. Clang. Yuan put strength into his right and holding Quincy. His right hand holding the sword was trembling. Just once more, that was Yuan's limit right now. If he hadn't leveled up his mana stat to 3 digits, he wouldn't have been able to use Quincy like this. Whoosh. The wind rose beneath Yuan's feet. His body became light like a feather, and he floated up into the air with the wind. Skywalk activated. Movement speed increased by 100% for 5 seconds. Can walk on air for 5 seconds. A skill built into Hermes' footsteps. Skywalk, which could only be used once a day, was activated. Thud. He stepped on the empty void. His body, which had become as light as a feather, stepped on the void and flew forward, further and further. The distance was closing in an instant. 5 seconds. It wasn't a long time, but in this situation, it was time more precious than gold. Thump. The mana heart of the sea turtle beat even slower. The sea god's stone was embedded right in there. Quite deeply, too. The sea turtle's mana heart is much harder than most metals. It was the sea turtle's instinct to protect itself. A monster that huddled in its shell and struggled to survive. The mana heart of such a sea turtle was as hard as the shell that surrounded its body. It's meaningless if I come this far and can't cut it out. The sea god's stone was right before his eyes. If he just cut it out, he could have it in his hands. I'll cut it in one go. Tick, 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 tick. Once more, no. For the last time, Quincy's eyes emitted a dark light. At the same time, the color of Yuan's eyes also turned red. Fire Eyes reads the path. His vision brightened, and the mana heart containing the sea goddess stone entered his vuitance. The mana heart was larger than a house, and the sea goddess stone was small as an fingernail. If I couldn't find the location of the sea goddess stone no nego and get the chance in it, the monsters at the back would come crashing down on him like a gigantic wave. That would be troublesome. In a situation where he had to watch out of the things outside, he couldn't afford to give any more time and stamina to the monsters. Where is it? Yuan's eyes darted around. Where is it? Thump thump thump. The mana heart was beating faster and faster. His vision was extended by the effect of fire eyes and sensory field. The blue light emitted from the heart, which was the size of a house, was gradually getting smaller. The light that had gotten smaller had now changed to the size of a small rock. Somewhere in that light was the ocean god's stone. Should I gamble? Right before swinging the sword, at that very moment. Quine reacts to another fragment. A small stone embedded deep in the mana heart could be seen. Shuaik. Swoosh. Thud, thud, thud. Blood poured down like rain. It was the blood flowing inside the mana heart. Gulp, gulp. The blood soaked the ground. It wasn't just the mana heart that had been severed. Growl, hiss, hiss. The monsters that had been surrounding it as if to protect it were the same. The bodies of numerous monsters disappeared as if they had been annihilated. A round circle was drawn centered around the spot where the mana heart had been. They had all been severed. Before long, the monsters forgot that they had to protect the ocean god's stone and distance themselves. They looked very frightened. Hiss, kya. After a long time, when nothing happened, the monsters started to approach the spot where the mana heart had been, one by one. Squirm. Something submerged in the blood squirmed. There was no way the monsters with good eyesight could miss it. Growl, gulp. Some of the monsters gulped as if their appetites had been whetted. They exchanged glances for a moment. The largest sea serpent in the group stepped forward and opened its mouth. Snap. Its mouth opened wide as if it was going to swallow its prey in one gulp. The other monsters didn't dare to pounce on the sea serpent and huddled behind it. And then, the meal that had been submerged in the blood squirmed even more violently. Screech. A line was drawn in half on the sea serpent's body. Snap. The sea serpent's body split in two and fell powerlessly to the ground. The monsters that had been crushed by the sea serpent's bulk reacted in two ways. They either thought it was an opportunity and stepped forward, or they became even more frightened and retreated. Clank. In the blood, Eugene slowly got up. Since his right hand was broken, he wielded his sword with his left hand. As a result, the feeling of the sword's tip wasn't very smooth. Rough. After severing the mana heart of the sea turtle and drenching himself in its blood, Eugene wiped his face with his hand. The blood was wiped off on his hand. Eugene flicked the blood off his body and looked around. Growl. Kya. The monsters opened their mouths and gulped. It seemed like they had completely forgotten what had happened to the sea serpent just now. They were willing to risk their lives for just one meal. Monsters will be monsters, he thought. I'm tired. Eugene clenched and unclenched his right hand and looked down at his palm. He couldn't see it because he was wearing quine, but his right hand was torn and his bones were misaligned. It was because he had unreasonable to overused his strength. It's still difficult to handle quine perfectly. Is it a matter of skill rather than stats? The important stats going forward were magic power and stamina. The sense stat was needed to use sensory field more effectively. While the magic power stat was something he couldn't do anything about right now, there were plenty of ways to raise his other stats. I should focus on leveling up for now. He wondered if he had been too focused on climbing the tower because his stats were lacking. Climbing the tower was important, but he shouldn't neglect leveling up either. Okay, recovery's over. Eugene lifted his head. The smell of blood seemed to have gotten stronger, and a sea serpent was approaching him. Then, Eugene spread his left hand open. And then, within it, a blue-colored gem gleamed beautifully. Chapter 102. Player Kim Yu-won has passed the test. A message appeared on the player kit exclusive to the test supervisor. It was a message like a bolt from the blue for Theseus, who had been waiting for a long time. Passed. His pupils shook finely. He checked again, but it wasn't a mistake. Why? Sutar did not miss Theseus's subtle change in expression. Something's bothering you. What nonsense. Theseus was about to spit out a curse, but he couldn't finish his words. It was because Sutar's head, who had been talking to him, had turned to the side. Quote. Theseus's gaze followed Sutar. The direction was the sea where the sea turtle was. Swoosh. The sea turtle's head dropped down. Theseus doubted his own eyes. He had just checked the message, but now that he was checking it with his own eyes, it didn't feel real. Boom. The sea turtle's head, which had fallen into the sea, created a huge tsunami. The seawater that rose into the sky fell down and turned into rain. Whoosh. The rain wet Theseus's head. His mind flashed at the cold drops of water. Only now did he feel like he had finally returned to reality. Did a 20th floor player really kill the sea turtle? How many monsters were inside that sea turtle? He couldn't even guess. It could be thousands, or maybe tens of thousands. Finding the sea god's stone inside such a sea turtle. Was it even possible? Even rankers can't pass the test. No matter how strong Kim Yu-won was, he naturally thought that he would fail. Theseus had planned to move in earnest after Yu-won failed the test. Because from then on, even if they intervened, the administrator wouldn't intervene much. But, damn it, growl, Theseus shouted, find Kim Yu-won. Yes, Sutar did not stand still either. Block him. Yes, the giants and Olympus rankers moved at the same time. As the giant rankers blocked his way, Theseus glared at them. If you don't move now, history will repeat itself. If we move now, we will lose again. Does it not matter if Gigantomachi happens again? Wasn't this the preparation for it? Don't think such ridiculous threats will work. Sutar drew his sword, a blazing sword. It was the flame that symbolized Surtur, the top high ranker and the main character of the great event Ragnarok. Let's finish this here, Theseus. Flames. The surrounding air heated up. The sky turned red, and the land that had been cooled by the falling seawater became hot. The world was heated by Sutar's magic power. He's serious. Suddenly, Gigantomachia came to mind. Theseus had fought him 3 times, and neither of them had been able to finish the fight. The giant had always been the one to lose, so Sutar had chosen to retreat instead of finishing the fight. However, Theseus knew, all of those fights had been his defeats. He was not confident that he could defeat Sutar if he went all the way. Sutar, quote. History repeats itself, and it does not change. A smile appeared on Theseus' lips. At the same time, bubble, the middle of the sea began to boil. Sutar, who had a deep grudge against Olympus, remembered the phenomenon clearly. No way, puff, a large chariot rose from the bottom of the sea. A chariot covered in gold. The chariot, which was surrounded by flames as hot as Sutar's fire, was much smaller, but it was the one that Sutar remembered. The chariot of the sun. It's a mass-produced model, but you remember it well. It was a replica of the sun chariot that Apollo rode. The sun chariot, which had no horses to pull it, flew up into the sky and stopped. The door of the chariot opened, and about 10 rankers poured out. What the hell is this? The weather is getting hot. It's because of that guy. Surtur. No, it's Satar. I can see why you'd be confused. All those guys' kids look alike. But he's changed a lot since he became a demon. How so? He's much more annoying. The rankers who had disembarked from the sun chariot began to chatter as they looked at the giant Satar. They were the rankers from Poseidon's side who had come after receiving Theseus' contact. What do you think? Theseus looked at Satar and the giant rankers who had come with him. And even the young giants hiding behind them. History repeats itself, doesn't it? Theseus, you little crunch. Satar gnashed his teeth. History repeats itself. He had heard these words from Theseus many times. It was what Theseus had said in the last battle of Gigantomachia. Unable to finish the fight and overcome the numerical disadvantage, Satar had no choice but to flee with his fellow giants each time. And those words of Theseus had been replayed countless times in his dreams until now. As the son of Poseidon, aren't you ashamed? When did you guys ever think of our father with such pride? It's funny. Theseus, who had become more relaxed, finally raised his trident. Satar, who was holding a flaming sword, glared at the rankers who had disembarked from the sun chariot. There were exactly 10 of them. All of them were rankers from Olympus, and they were all fairly skilled. There were no rankers as high-ranking as Theseus, but the other giants would not be able to handle them. It was obvious that even he would be held back by Theseus. In the end, it's like this again. That was when it happened. Kya! A roar came from the direction of the sea turtle's extended body. It was the cry of sea monsters. How noisy. Are those sea serpents? There are a lot of those, but that's not all. I see wyverns too. Monsters appeared above the sea. This wasn't a particularly unique situation. A fight was taking place near the sea. Furthermore, the sea was becoming very hot because of the flames from Sutard and Helios. It wasn't strange that the monsters were drawn to it. There was no need to panic. After all, these were just monsters that appeared on the 20th floor. Even if dozens or hundreds of sea serpents attacked, they wouldn't be able to handle even one ranker. However, am I seeing things? Why are there so many of them? They're all sea serpents. If their numbers were in the thousands or tens of thousands instead of the dozens or hundreds, then it would be a different story. Shwa! Their numbers grew rapidly, looking like a giant tsunami. Black waves made of sea serpents surged forward. Among them, there were rare monsters like wyverns, electric eels, anglerfish, and seahorses. In addition, hey, what's that? Leviathan, it's Leviathan. What, really? Oh man, what's going on here? Leviathan. It was a monster that had only appeared a few times on the 20th floor. Normally, it could only be seen on much higher floors. The boss monster that ruled the 20th floor had appeared in the middle of this chaos. This was a disaster that had never happened before. Monsters that normally killed and ate each other wouldn't suddenly start moving together and living in groups. Don't tell me. Theseus suddenly remembered a legend. He who finds the stone of the sea shall become the god of the sea. This was a legend that had been passed down for a long time. When Theseus first heard the story, he laughed at it. It was just an item. No matter how great an item it was impossible to gain the power of a god from just one item. It didn't make sense. However, it's real. The power to rule over everything in the sea. It was the power of the god of the sea. Greed appeared in Theseus' eyes. He thought he understood why Poseidon had been looking for it so much. Legends were usually false, but this one wasn't. Kiya! A giant serpent rose up into the sky, whipping the sea and piercing the clouds. Leviathan, also known as the sea dragon, looked more than qualified to be the ruler of the sea. This was Theseus' first time seeing it. And he realized something for sure. He wasn't confident that he could hunt it, even if he risked getting a penalty. That was when it happened. Shwa! One side of the ocean parted. And from the gap, a single person leisurely walked out. Sorry to bother you all while you're having a hard time. Thud. As you can see, I'm a bit tired right now. The sight of Wu Wan, half soaked in blood and seawater, was quite comical. Not to mention his hair, he was drenched from head to toe and looked like a drowned rat. So I'd appreciate it if you'd all just leave. Whoosh. Blue light poured out from between the fingers of his clenched fist. Theseus's eyes widened as he realized what it was. The stone of the sea. His father, Theseus, had searched so desperately for that item. The item that would make him the successor of Poseidon was right there. Hand it over. Crackle, crackle, a penalty ran through Theseus's body. It was a change that began the moment he revealed his hostility toward Wuan, an opponent who wasn't a rancor, and drew on his mana. Swish, swish, water that had surged from the ocean gathered at Theseus's feet. Theseus's body, standing on the wave, slid quickly toward Wuan. Theseus. The penalty that began to flow through Theseus's body wasn't ordinary. Regardless of whether the administrator noticed the current situation, the idea was to snatch the stone from Wuan in one breath. Sutar tried to block Theseus, brandishing his sword, engulfed in flames. But that was only for a moment. Where do you think you're going? Block Sutar. The rankers who had gotten off the chariot of the sun blocked Sutar's path at once. Sutar brandished his sword without hesitation. Whoosh. Flames swirled around the sword, the size of a house. A blow that could cut down a small mountain was carried on Sutar's sword. Get out of the way, you bastards. Boom. A fierce flame drew a line. Sutar's sword swung toward the rankers blocking his path and crushed the body of one of them in an instant. But the difference in numbers was overwhelming. Boom. Sutar's sword ultimately failed to penetrate the rankers' defensive wall. No matter how strong he was, he couldn't sweep away nearly 10 rankers with a single sword strike. Damn it, Sutar urgently retrieved his sword. The rankers didn't seem to have any intention of fighting back in the first place, so they held their ground without charging toward Sutar. There was no way he could break through quickly at this rate. He only just passed the test, but I can't let him take the stone here. Sutar's gaze briefly turned to Theseus and Wuan. And at that moment, Sutar saw an unbelievable sight. What the? Theseus, sitting on the ground with a blank, hopeless expression. And in front of him, Wuan, who was standing there looking down at Theseus. Chapter 103. Wuan's sword moved slowly. Wuan's sword, which lightly brushed the tip of the spear, brushed against the spearhead and aimed for Theseus' neck. His head was blank. His mind, which had become a blank slate, was gradually filled with thoughts. What the hell is going on? It was a thought he didn't usually have, but he seemed to be having a lot of it today. It had been a long time since he had looked up at someone with his head held high. If it weren't for those huge giants, it would have been decades. That was probably the last time he saw Poseidon. Suddenly, my strength disappeared. The moment he used the water as a means of transportation and slid. For a moment, Theseus felt the power he was wielding oxidize. When the water disappeared, he lost his balance. He fell to the floor as if he was collapsing. That was why Theseus was looking up at Wuan now. You can't do anything without water. Wuan, who was holding the sea god's stone, muttered as if he was pathetic. You're just like a fish. Puck. Veins popped out on Theseus' forehead. The one in front of him was none other than a player who participated in the test he was supervising. He was someone who had to look up at him for a long time, even if he looked up at him. How dare you say such a thing? Swoosh. Water gathered on Theseus' trident. The water condensed at one point had considerable power. It was small, but it possessed the power of a great tsunami. As he got up and swung his trident at Wuan in one breath. How dare you, is something you can only say when you're qualified. Pow! The water droplets that had gathered on the trident burst out, and a large amount of water spread out in all directions. But you don't seem like it. What the hell is this? Another unbelievable thing happened. Theseus felt his strength being scattered by something's intervention. And there was only one thing he could think of as the cause. Wang, the stone in Wuan's hand. It was the item that made the holder the god of the sea. Creak, his teeth gnashed on their own. His pride was hurt. No matter how great an item he had, no matter how strong the player Wuan was, he was on his knees to a participant in the test he was conducting. How dare you, how dare you, how dare you? Theseus raised his trident again. He didn't use mana. It was obvious that the water attribute mana he wielded would be nullified by the influence of the sea god's stone. Wang, a spear wielded with only strength. Wuan looked at the tip of the spear and clicked his tongue. You don't understand what I'm saying. A magic sword was formed on Wuan's sword. It was difficult to use Quina, but he still had plenty of mana and stamina left. The Eye of the Storm reads the path. The sensory zone is activated. Thanks to the combination of the two skills, he could clearly see the path Theseus' spearhead was moving. The twitching of his muscles, the amount of force, and even his footwork. Tess watched the spear, which soared above him, while firmly gripping his trident. Unlike before, after the sword was swung, the sword that flew towards Theseus' neck was surprisingly fast. He managed to quickly twist his head, so his neck was not cut, but Theseus' blue hair was cut and a handful of it fell to the floor. Kong, Theseus, trident and Yuan's sword clashed. The sword didn't budge. He added magic power to his lacking strength. Yuan immediately dropped his sword from the trident and swung his sword at Theseus. Wang, Boang, Zing, Zhaoyojung. The sword flew towards the blind spot in an instant. It wasn't fast or strong enough to be unstoppable. Even if he didn't use magic power, Theseus was a few levels higher in terms of impact power. However, what's so tricky about this? Theseus, who was actually receiving the sword, couldn't predict the path of the sword as it flew. It was clearly slow enough to be seen with the naked eye, but it was difficult to react because it flew from a blind spot outside his field of vision. Furthermore, he's preparing to dodge before the spear flies. He didn't feel like he would get hit at all. It felt like he was facing a loach, not a human. Although Yuan's movements weren't that fast as the sword moved, he was narrowly dodging the spear. What should I do? Theseus' eyes flashed as he watched Yuan's sword tip and pondered. If he's not using magic power to manipulate water. Theseus was of Poseidon's lineage, and he had mainly learned and practiced skills related to water. The nature of his mana was the same. He was naturally talented in handling water attribute mana, and he had been able to freely convert the attributes of his mana since he was a newbie. And now, all of that was blocked. But that didn't mean Theseus wasn't learning other skills. Keying, mana gathered at the tip of Theseus' spear. It wasn't a special skill. It was a magic spear, made of pure mana that had not undergone attribute conversion. Kwang, Kudu, the spear pressed down on the sword. Yuan's feet, unable to withstand the force, dug into the ground and sank. He's calmer than I thought. Theseus' greatest weakness was his mental. He thought it would take a while to recover once he was shocked, but it seemed that he had pulled himself together as much as he had been hit. Let go, Pajijijik. The penalty flowing through Theseus' body grew stronger. He must have been in a lot of pain, but he ignored it and pulled up with force. The stone, quack. The ground beneath Yuan, where the trident was swung was torn apart. Yuan, who used Hermes' footsteps to jump twice in a row, was able to quickly get out of the way. Quack. Theseus gripped his trident tightly and glared at Yuan, who was leaping up. Now he could chase after him. However, other Olympians approached Theseus and grabbed his shoulders. Theseus glared at them, thinking they were hindering him. His face was full of murderous intent. It seemed like he would kill anyone who got in his way, even his allies. However, the situation was not good enough to just back down because of his fierce expression. Look over there. Only then did Theseus come to his senses and turned his head to look around. Monsters had already gathered in darkness. The Leviathan, which had been seen far away, was also approaching nearby. This is our only chance to escape. We need to hurry because the giants are here too. Escape. Theseus's eyes darted around quickly. The sea god's stone shining in Yuan's hand. And thousands, tens of thousands of monsters rising from the sea to the land. If they reached land, it would be irreversible. Maybe there really wouldn't be a chance to escape as they said. However, find the stone. Even now, his father Poseidon's words lingered in his head. If you do, I will acknowledge you as my son. Theseus's face collapsed. It was something he had always wanted. He just wanted to be acknowledged as a son. Poseidon had promised him something he had always thought was impossible. Something he had always wanted was right before his eyes. Retreat. But the only decision he could make was to run away. He turned his head and saw Satar had already defeated 4 rankers. As before, he couldn't tell who would win, but the situation was completely different. He turned his head and looked at Yuan. He was still intact. While Satar had taken care of 4 rankers, Theseus had failed to defeat Yuan and take the sea god's stone. Even though I have the stone, I still couldn't subdue that bastard. Thinking about it, that was how it was. From the moment he first met swords and spears, he hadn't considered Yuan as a player. If it weren't for the penalty flowing through his body, he might have even forgotten that Yuan was a player, not a ranker. Kim Yuan. Theseus glared at Yuan as if he was going to kill him. Right now, he couldn't do anything about it because he was by the sea and the giants were in the way, but that was only for now. Someday, I'll definitely kill you with my own hands. And the stone of the sea. He would take back that treasure. Let's go. Theseus got on the sun's chariot. The sun's chariot, which carried all the rankers, soared up. And then, the Leviathan arrived. Kya, a huge tail that could cover the sun in the sky descended upon the sun's chariot. Kwa Yang, With the sun carriage, the tail that slammed down on the sea turned the sea upside down. The seawater that shot up covered the sky, and for a moment, it blocked everyone's view. And after a while, they ran away. Yuan could see a small sun rising into the sky. Even though it was just a replica, the sun carriage was the sun carriage. It probably wouldn't be that difficult to escape from Leviathan's tail. Did we win? It was a great shock. It wasn't that he had finished the fight, nor was it that he had chosen to run away first. Rather, the situation was reversed this time. Sutar looked around. The remaining giants, and the monsters that were scouring the sea, following Yuan's orders. It started to feel real. We won. In their long history, the giants had won their first victory. Cheers. Wow. Clang crash. Wooden and glass cups collided. The drinks filled and the cups flowed and spilled on the floor. The giants were in a festive mood. It was the first time they had won a battle against Olympus. Hey, bring me another barrel. You go get it, you bastard. Meat too. Am I your errand boy? Huh, although it wasn't a big battle like Gigantomachi, the joy of victory was sweet. Yuan shook his head at the noisy sound coming from outside. I guess everyone's excited. I didn't know they'd start eating and drinking as soon as they got back. These kids these days, Urfa muttered with a click of his tongue, but his face was full of joy. The joy of victory was that great for him. Perhaps if it weren't for his pride, he might have gone out and eaten and drank with them. Why don't you go and join them? You're the star of the party. One drink for them is like a whole barrel for me. It's burdensome, and I don't really enjoy drinking. Oh, I see. Urfa, who had been smiling happily, suddenly looked gloomy. But I'm worried. Like before, Olympus is going to give you a harder time now. The Stone of the Sea. The Poseidon Stone was a treasure that Poseidon had been searching for thousands of years. His obsession with it went without saying, and now that he knew who had it, he wouldn't give up on it. I don't think so. However, Yuan didn't seem to care much about Urfa's worries. He said, I don't think so, but there was a hint of certainty in his answer. Urfa asked with a puzzled expression. Why not? Yuan didn't answer. A face that seemed to know something. Urfa saw it, Yuan's lips, which were slowly rising. And now, Yuan was recalling his conversation with Hercules. Chapter 104. Once we obtain the sea god's stone, we will become a target for Olympus. Odin was the first to bring up the subject. Although he wasn't one to talk much, it seemed he couldn't hold back this time. The sea god's stone was a double-edged sword. It's definitely a good item, and we must never hand it over to Olympus, but the repercussions of taking it will be just as severe. Should we just give up on the sea god's stone and waste our time? Let's just play it safe. It wouldn't be bad to all perish together. Opinions were divided. Until then, there were more opinions that it was dangerous to openly oppose Poseidon. And there were opinions that playing it safe wouldn't change the outcome. Somehow, Yuan ended up fighting Olympus early on by saving Hephaestus, but until this point, the dangerous opinion was more common. However, there's no need to worry. Someone who knew the internal affairs of Olympus better than anyone else opened his mouth. My great-uncle won't be able to move actively. Do you know something? At Odin's question, Heracles nodded. The three main gods of Olympus are related by blood, but they are not very close. Especially between my father and my great-uncle Poseidon. Isn't that a well-known story? More so than that famous story. At Heracles' words, everyone gathered in the seats listened attentively. It was because they were curious, as it was a story they had never heard before. After my father acquired the heavenly stone out of the three stones and created lightning, more than half of Olympus' power belonged to my father. Everyone knew about this up to this point. The power of lightning made Zeus' power several times stronger, and because of that, Zeus was able to become the undisputed king of Olympus. After that, my father realized something. He realized that the sea god's stone and the black god's stone must not fall into the hands of his other great uncles. Zeus doesn't want the sea god's stone to fall into Poseidon's hands. Is that what you're saying? Yes. On the other hand, is there any chance that Zeus is after the sea god's stone? My father is so lazy. If it wasn't Poseidon but a single player, even my father wouldn't be able to move. Because he wears the crown. Really, in reality, Zeus had ascended to the throne of Olympus and had stopped most of his activities after the Gigantomachi ended. Also, if Zeus, the king of Olympus, were to make a move, the other large guilds would also make moves. As Heracles said, Zeus couldn't make a move himself for the actions of a single player, not Poseidon. Indeed, at that time, I was also mindful of that Zeus fellow. That was a fact that Odin, the master of Asgard, a representative rival guild of Olympus, also knew well. Zeus couldn't pay attention to anything outside of Olympus. In other words, if the sea god's stone went outside, Zeus would have no choice but to be wary of Poseidon. Then, I have a rough answer. He had a rough outline. I can't give up the sea god's stone, so I have no choice but to make Zeus and Poseidon perish together. Why not? Kugung. The great temple shook. The ground shook as if an earthquake had occurred, and the air sank heavily. His third son, Orion, who had brought the news, answered on one knee. It seems that a clash with the giants is absolutely forbidden. Orion couldn't continue speaking easily because his spine was tingling. It seemed that if he uttered even one more word, his body would be crushed by the being in front of him. Why did I have to lose the lottery? Someone had to deliver the news. And the man who received the news in front of him was a being with hair that resembled the sea more than the sea. It was Poseidon, the sea god, one of the three main gods of Olympus. Not the giants, but just one player. It seems that the heavenly throne doesn't think of this matter so lightly. The heavenly throne, it was the highest of the many names given to the great high rankers of Olympus. Another name was given because they dared not call their names carelessly. And Poseidon, the throne of the sea in front of him, was furious at his words. He just doesn't want the stone of the sea to fall into my hands. Kwang, Wujik, the struck table shattered. Poseidon, who had struck it with his fist, glared at Orion with a red face. What do you think? Do you think Zeus, that bastard, is bluffing? How could I ever think such a thing? Orion, who could neither do this nor that. No matter which side he took, there would be a problem. The temple had tens of thousands of eyes and ears, and the moment he answered incorrectly, his words would reach Zeus's ears. Damn it! Poseidon gritted his teeth as he recalled Zeus's face. Although they were brothers of the same blood, they were distant. Especially after Zeus ascended to the throne of Olympus. Especially after he obtained the item called the Heavenly Thunderstone and used it to have Hephaestus create lightning bolts. Zeus's power far surpassed that of Poseidon and Hades, and the balance of power among the three main gods had been broken. I beg your pardon, but it is also said that we cannot touch a player who is not even a ranker. When will he ever stop gnashing his teeth over the fact that I interfered with his capture of Hephaestus? That's right, son of AB*TCH. Poseidon, who had been openly cursing Zeus, smashed several more pieces of furniture in his frustration. The rankers in the temple prayed that Poseidon's anger would not be directed at them. After smashing the furniture for a while, Poseidon slowly calmed down. Then, his mind finally became organized, and he could understand why Zeus had made such a judgment. He chooses profit over immediate revenge. As expected, Zeus had always been like this. He valued reason over emotion and pursued profit. That was why Poseidon, despite being his younger brother, had always been secretly afraid of Zeus. More than anything else, it was because of his personality that seemed impervious to pain. No matter how talented that Kim Yu-won is, he's still just a player. It will be hundreds, if not thousands, of years before he has the same power and influence as me. It was inevitable that the giant in front of him would take precedence over the growing sprout. In the end, Zeus had given up on the small prey named Kim Yu-won in order to keep Poseidon in check. Thud. Poseidon, who had risen from his seat in a rage, sat down again. So, the justification is on their side. The reason why Zeus was able to openly hold him in check, as he was now, was ultimately because of justification. He was also invoking the laws of the tower, rules created by several large guilds, including many administrators. But Olympus's internal rule forbidding clashes with the Titans was also intertwined. I guess I'll have to reflect on myself for a while. A hollow laugh. Poseidon lost a lot from this incident. He lost the opportunity to find the sea stone that he had longed for, the legitimacy to move by deploying rankers, and his qualifications. It was as if he had lost everything. Yu-won opened his eyes. The noisy party was over, and after exchanging a few words without a big farewell, he went up to the 21st floor. It felt like he had slept for 2 days. That meant that his physical condition had gotten that bad. It was the aftereffect of using quina excessively. I shouldn't overdo it. His torn and corroded hand had healed, and his creaking body felt quite refreshed. As expected, there's nothing better than sleep for recovery. Thud, thud, sitting there and blankly staring at the ceiling, Yu-won began to slowly stretch his body. As he stretched his stiff joints, an image was drawn in his head. My fight with Theseus was my loss. Theseus was a high ranker. To begin with, he wasn't an opponent that the current Yu-won could face. More than anything, the difference in stats and level was too great. The tip of his spear, which had pushed him without using mana, still came to mind vividly. If I hadn't used sensory field and fire eyes at the same time, I wouldn't have been able to take it all. Yu-1 clearly recognized the extent of his abilities. I was also lucky. He had used the sea stone to nullify Theseus's magic power. It was an ability that couldn't be used for long. Furthermore, if Theseus had noticed earlier that the seal on his magic power was related to water, the situation would have been worse. Of course, Yu-1 was also too exhausted to use Quina by that point. If we fight properly, I still can't win. Even with the sea stone item, which gave him a much better matchup, the outcome was the same. It was because the fight had been so lopsided to begin with. However, Yu-1 was not discouraged. Rather, the eyes of Yu-1, who was drawing the fight with Theseus in his head, sparkled even more. Not yet. He had put up quite a fight. Much sooner than expected. He had already regained this much strength on the 20th floor. Yu-1 wasn't stupid enough not to know how much strength he had, but he still wasn't sure. That's why he fought Theseus when the opportunity came. And only then did he become certain. I've come this far. Originally, it would take 3 years to reach this point. At the longest, he thought it would take 5 years. Even if others knew, they would think it was incredibly short. After all, rankers were existences that were originally created over dozens of years, or even thousands of years at the longest. However, Wu Jin now possessed a power comparable to rankers, even though he wasn't one yet. It was as if he had not only set sail with the wind, but had also encountered a great typhoon and was unable to control himself. Now the 21st floor. He had more or less passed the lower floors. He had also accumulated strength and obtained important items and skills that he needed to acquire from the test. This was enough to convince him. I can run a little faster. Since he had already come as far as obtaining the sea god's stone, time was now on his side. For the time being, Zeus and Poseidon wouldn't be able to move as they were keeping an eye on each other. Should he take the test right away? Or should he raise his level, as he had decided on the 20th floor? His decision wasn't very difficult. Since he had obtained the sea god's stone, the immediate task was set. It's been a while. Wu Jin got up from his seat and began writing a message to the player kit first. Old man. Time passed. The incident on the 20th floor spread throughout the tower quite quickly. The Stone of the Sea. The item that Poseidon, the sea god and king of the sea, had been searching for. It was said that Kim Wu Jin, not any other player or ranker, had obtained it. I thought he was still a weakling, but he's actually quite an interesting fellow. An old, white-haired monkey burst into laughter upon hearing the news. The fools of Olympus must be feeling bitter. The king of Asgard also smiled at the joyful news he had heard for the first time in a long time. If the opportunity arises, someday. The Asura with 3 heads and 6 arms burned with fighting spirit at the thought of a future rival appearing. Kim Wu Jin, the player who obtained the Stone of the Sea. The news was spreading secretly among the high-ranking rankers associated with Olympus. Chapter 105. You found this kind of thing well. Hephaestus, who first saw the sea godstone, remained speechless for several minutes. Even the words he uttered after that were exclamations accompanied by hollow laughter, and he continued to observe after that. A blue stone shined brightly in Hephaestus' hand. Hephaestus asked after examining the sea godstone for a long time. Is this perhaps that thing? Yu-1 didn't ask what that thing was and answered. Yes, I was an obvious question. Really, is this really that Stone of the Sea? Yes, Omi, OHMY, OHMY. Hephaestus, who exclaimed several times, eventually searched forth grindstone handle, saying, this is ridiculous. Of course, it only sounded that way to Yu-1's ears, but in reality, it must have been a different word with the same meaning. How did you get this? It's something that my grandfather hasn't been able to find for over 1,000 years. I was lucky. Are you serious? Hephaestus's face turned red as if was about to explode. However, there was nothing more he could say. What more could he say when he was just lucky? Fortunately, Hephaestus didn't worry about her or other giants. Still, with this, I won't be able to care about you fourth time being, as I'll be walking a tightrope between my father and grandfather on Olympus. Hephaestus was one of the people who understood the internal affairs of the Olympus the best. He also knew about the relationship between Zeus and Poseidon and expected their conflict to be maximized with the appearance of the sea godstone. And the moment that conflict began, Yu-1 would inevitably be left alone. Zeus wouldn't be able to move directly because he was watching other large guilds, and Poseidon wouldn't be able to move because he was watching Zeus. In the end, Yuan would be the one who benefited the most from this situation. Hephaestus looked at Yuan as if he was curious after thinking that far. Did you even expect this? He was such a smart bastard that even had such doubts. But no matter what, it couldn't be. That was impossible unless he knew the internal affairs of the Olympus beyond just knowing how to find the sea godstone. It was true that Yuan was the strongest player he had ever seen, but that was a completely different matter from simply being excellent. And this, Hephaestus examined the sea godstone in his hand closely. It really does resemble my father's thunderbolt. The nature was completely different. But it was similar. It wasn't just the sea godstone. It was the same when he worked on the jewel of Kennedy in Yuan's hand. The two greatly resembled the thunderbolt, an atom that was no different from Zeus's symbol, and the core material. Can you process it? Yuan asked without any doubt. He had already processed the thunder god stone, a material for thunderbolt. He had also worked on the black god stone, and of course, he could do the same for the sea god stone. Hephaestus answered yes and squeezed the sea god stone in his palm. Processing is secondary, but this is the same as one in your hand. I'll need other materials to make it into a proper item. No matter what, he couldn't create materials that didn't exist. There's no stock of adamantium right now, and there's nowhere to get it. How long will it take to process? It'll probably take a boot and days this time too. Is that so? Yuan nodded after thinking for a while. I'll get the materials as soon as possible. The materials? Yes. Do you have a lot of money? Not that much. I used it all when I made this. Yuan said so and shook the Kennedy in his right hand. The material that can withstand the carved sacred water stone should be at least as good as the adamantium that went into Quina. You wouldn't be able to buy such material with money right now. Yuan spoke as if it was easy to get it. Also, Hephaestus, who was listening to that absurd statement, felt strangely realistic. He's the type of guy who does what he says he'll do. Of course, Yuan didn't know how long his, as much as possible, would be. It could take several years if it was long, or a few months if it was short. But one thing was for sure, Yuan would get something that most people couldn't even touch once in their lifetime. Where are you going now? Hephaestus asked, rolling up his arms for work. He didn't think Yuan would just be hanging around here. He was always on the move, so he would definitely go up again. Are you going to challenge the test right away? I bought some time like you said. On his way down to the first floor, Yuan had already thought about what to do with the remaining time. I plan to spend some time leveling up for now. Buying time. Hephaestus paid more attention to the word, time, than what Yuan was going to do. Don't tell me you're really going to fight Olympus. It was a story he had heard before. Yuan, who had already become an enemy of Olympus because of him, said that he would drag Olympus down from the sky. He thought it was ridiculous. A reckless young boy who didn't know the ways of the world. He thought it was understandable, as it was a time when he felt like he could have everything in the world. But that's what dreams are like. At first, they are bigger than anyone else, but as time goes by and they learn about reality, they become smaller and fainter. However, Yuan was the opposite. Rather, his dream grew bigger and more specific as time went on. Besides, is that all? Yuan's goal was not just Olympus. What do you mean? Hephaestus, who thought it would be a yes or no answer, was taken aback when an unexpected answer came back. Yuan didn't answer anymore. Instead, he nodded once at Hephaestus and turned towards the outside of the workshop. Then I'll leave it to you. Don't worry, I'll deposit the payment separately later. Okay. Hephaestus was quick-witted. It wasn't in his nature to pry further into a subject that someone didn't want to answer. If he didn't say anything, there must be a reason. Thinking so, Hephaestus began searching the workshop for a fine carving knife. Creak. Yuan left the workshop after leaving the sacred water stone with Hephaestus. He seemed to be worried. It seemed like he was fighting too big of an enemy. They hadn't spent much time together, but Hephaestus was a thoughtful person. He probably wouldn't show it, but he must be worried sick. If he knew everything, he'd fall backwards. The egg of Wiggles. Was it because the hatching rate had increased? Now, the creature, who was awake for about half of the day, answered Yuan. What does it know? Yuan laughed a little and spoke to the egg for the first time in a while. I think you'll be able to meet your siblings soon. The egg of tilts its head. It was still a young child who didn't know anything. What would happen when it hatched? Half of him was excited, and half of him was worried. It's going to be fun. The rotten parts of this tower will start to show one by one. The egg still looked like it didn't understand. Of course. All this creature cared about was one thing. Are you going to eat them and grow up? Opening square bracket quote question mark. Of egg, nods its head. A guy who's only interested in eating. Like a toddler with a big appetite, the guy showed a strong appetite towards the outer. The egg grows by eating them. I don't know what's inside the egg, but I'm sure that it's at least friendly to me. Soon, Yuan moved towards his destination. Let me eat them. The world of the first floor is vast. Many worlds are, but the first floor was particularly so. There were still unexplored areas that reached half of the area. Leaving the starting town, after passing through the forest and the forest again, and eventually a second world that wasn't marked on the map appeared. About 80% of the area has been developed at this point. The final known area of the first floor was 5 times the size of Earth where Yuan lived, so it wasn't surprising. Thanks to that, walking around was out of the question for Yuan. Instead, thank you for using the sun's chariot, the pride of Olympus. A replica of the sun's chariot that he saw on the 20th floor. He rode one of the fastest transportation methods in the tower. 1,000 points have been used. Of course, he had to pay an expensive fee in return. The sun's chariot was a vehicle that could carry around 10 people. The sun's chariot, which boasted a fast speed that allowed it to travel between the upper and lower floors of the tower, was a symbol of Apollo, and it was said that the real one traveled between the first floor and the top of the tower in one day. Please come again next time, customer. With a loud greeting, Yuan got off the sun's chariot. It took him 2 whole days to fly there. His body was stiff because he didn't do anything during that time. I'm here. Yuan looked at the tall wall that stretched out before him. The black wall looked as if it was dividing the boundary between night and day. He approached it and reached out his hand to touch it, and he felt a hard and cold wall. It was right here, the end of the world. The wall of the vast world called the tower. The outer was right outside of here. I thought it would never break. No high ranker was able to break this wall. Even Zeus, the great king of Olympus, Odin, the king of Asgard, Asura, Heracles, and Sun Ogong, the great sage, heaven's equal. They couldn't even make a small dent, let alone break the wall. That's why they thought the tower was safe. No, they didn't even think that there was an outside in the first place. For the wall to collapse on its own. Swish, Yuan took his hand off the wall and turned around. He didn't come all the way here to just admire the view. He came here after 2 days because he was sure. Because that's not a dungeon that can exist on the first floor. Most of the dungeons that existed on a floor had a difficulty that was similar to the level of the players on that floor. However, that's only if it was a dungeon that was created naturally. What Yuan was looking for was a dungeon that was created. Yuan is looking for the path. Eyes that had turned red. Yuan found a single mark on the empty field. If you get the chance, go check that place out, too. The one who gave him this information was Odin, the king of Asgard. Wang, inside Yuan's inventory, the sword of Tatsuka, the reward he got after passing the first floor's test, started to vibrate. It looks like that bastard hid something incredible there before he died. Wang. The sword started to get excited. Yuan, who grabbed the fragment of the sword of Tatsuka in his inventory, finally started to see the path. I found it. A dungeon hidden at the end of the world. Susano's dungeon, rank 57. Susano, the top high ranker. His legacy was right here. Chapter 106. Susano-O's relic was discovered several hundred years later. Of the 3 nobles, Amaterasu and Tsukuyomi had been searching for Susano-O's last relic. They believed that only by finding the relic he left behind would they be able to complete the Trinity artifact. Even if that weren't the case, the 3 nobles had been comrades who had climbed the tower together since long ago, and they were like brothers. If it was the relic of Susano-O, who was also one of the 3 nobles, it was enough reason to find it, even if it was just a rotten branch. But, it's my lunch now. Yuan recalled the famous quote from a survival expert and moved his feet lightly. Wang, the trembling floor. No, it wasn't actually trembling. It was just that the fragment of the sword of Tatsuka was reacting to Susano-O's relic, making it feel like it was trembling only to Yuan. The 3 nobles had the fragments but didn't know the location of the relic. It took me hundreds of years to get here with the sword of Tatsuka. Yuan had overcome all the effort put in during that long time with a single trick. The clockwork is good, but it's good. Shriek. Yuan held the broken fragment of the sword in his reverse grip. Then, he stabbed the fragment into the floor in the direction the fragment was reacting to. Poof. Quote. At first, nothing happened. Even though a long time had passed and it was still quite bright, the fragment was just sharply embedded in the floor. Like that, for a moment. Did something go wrong? Just when he was getting anxious, thinking the worst, a message rang out. Hidden dungeon, Susanoo-O's relic, has been discovered. Verifying qualifications. Qualifications met. Entering. Wah. The scenery around the fragment of the sword of Tatsuka, which was embedded in the floor, turned white. A vision that had lost its color. Immediately afterward, the white world was colored again. Swoosh. Shua. The world, which quickly regained its color like paint, was not the empty field where Yuan had first been. A crimson wasteland, a huge tower that soared high into the sky. Hyena with red fur scattered everywhere. Storm the tower. Obtain the hidden relic of Susanoo. You can leave the dungeon if you find the key. Ironically, once you entered the dungeon, you couldn't leave it at will. It was because the entrance and exit were different in the first place. Pook. Yuan pulled out the fragment he had stabbed into the floor and retrieved it. This wasn't something to use in a fight. The sword of Tatsuka couldn't function properly unless he found the other fragments and completed the sword. Grr. Kung. Kung. The hyenas scattered across the wasteland began to bark at Yuan. Judging from the drool already dripping from their mouths, they must have been very hungry. The key or the relic is probably in there. Yuan looked up at the huge tower in front of him. A tower that reached the clouds, each floor as wide as the Colosseum. It was quite a large dungeon. I know the location of the dungeon, but I don't know the contents. Shring. Yuan drew his sword and held it. The number of hyenas gathered was not insignificant. Moreover, they were hyenas in appearance, but their size was like that of tigers. Monsters that appeared on the 40th floor. They were blood-sucking hyenas. A race that eats the blood of other living beings and has strong combat power. They have a habit of living in groups. The experience is very good. Yuan's lips curled up. Pgggg, mana bursting out of the quinae. There was no need to use, hell. What would start now wouldn't be a fight but a one-sided slaughter. The completion rate of Cheonsalsung is not increasing. The completion rate of Cheonsalsung is not increasing. The completion rate of Cheonsalsung increases by 0.001%. The completion rate of Cheonsalsung. The completion rate doesn't go up. There was no regret. He hadn't expected the completion rate, which hadn't gone up in all this time, to suddenly go up just because he was catching guys like this in the first place. It's about 0.003%. Tuck. Yuan flicked his sword lightly as a drop of blood fell from it. Thud. Blood fell neatly onto the wasteland. Passing the hyenas on the floor and taking a step, Yuan checked the completion rate of Cheonsalsung. Completion rate. 99.546%. It was a completion rate that didn't rise. It was fortunate that the percentage rose by 0.5% after catching the sea turtle during the 20th floor test. He had hoped that he would be able to fulfill the completion rate back then. It's still too early. The completion of Cheonsalsung became more anticipated when he started to feel that his stats were lacking. Cheonsalsung was a skill that increased his stats one by one as the completion rate increased. If it was completed, he might be able to fill in his lacking stats. Name: Kim Yuan. Level: 80. Strength: 90. Agility: 80. Health: 83. Perception: 87. Magic power: 100. Opening square bracket. Closing square bracket. His stats had risen quite a bit after leveling up and as his proficiency in Cheonsalsung neared its end. Including the level he had raised after catching the sea turtle, it was exactly level 80. His other stats were also quite high, but his perception stat showed a particularly steep growth. Perception: 87. His lowest stat had suddenly become his third highest stat. As his stat was low in the first place, it was a stat that had risen steadily every time he leveled up. Stats didn't rise much when they were already high. That was the case not only for stat increases through elixirs but also for leveling up. Thanks to that, his magic power stat had completely stopped at 100. 7 stats have increased because of sensory field. If things go well, perception might reach 3 digits before my other stats. The tower that appeared before his eyes was enormous. The number of monsters inhabiting it would probably be considerable as well. He had packed enough food and water in his inventory and wanted to reach level 100 in this dungeon if possible. Creak. The entrance was a door about 2 meters high, which wasn't very big. In the first place, it seemed that Susanoo hadn't considered the possibility of giants entering this place. Screech. Musty dust rose as he opened the rusty iron door that had been there for a long time. Yu-won looked around the inside of the first floor. Unlike the small door, the ceiling was high. About 10 meters, that was the height of one floor. Of course, there was no rule that the height of every floor had to be the same. Yu-won looked left and right. Compared to the height, the width isn't that big. Is it a maze-type dungeon? Just as he was about to check the inside of the dungeon. Entering Susanoo's dungeon, reach the 100th floor. Pass the test of Susanoo. Just like the tests on each floor, a test was set for Susanoo's relic as well. There were 2 goals, reaching the 100th floor and passing the test of Susanoo. It's like he made a miniature version of the tower. Yu-won had never met Susanoo. However, through the words of other colleagues who knew him, he had a rough idea of what kind of person he was. Susanoo, that little punk isn't even worth mentioning. The worst. Need I say more? I wanted to fight him. They say he uses his sword like art. If there's anyone who has killed the most humans in this tower, it might be that guy. His colleagues' evaluations of Susanoo. Those with a strong sense of justice, like Odin or Heracles, spoke of him with contempt. Asura flared up when he thought of Susanoo, and Kronos spoke rather indifferently. Most of the evaluations weren't good, but one thing was certain. Susanoo. No one denied his strength. Creak. Yu-won took a step towards Susanoo's dungeon. Screech. Thud. The door closed with a loud noise. Yu-won didn't look back. He had no intention of going back anyway. There was a separate problem. Swoosh. Purple fog appeared at the entrance. He felt a strange sensation. It wasn't that he felt any special mana. However, it gave him strange chills as he watched. It was a feeling he hadn't felt even when he had faced Yamata no Orochi. It's not magic power, or the aura of demons, or the power of outer gods. Recalling the now familiar sensation, Eugene narrowed his eyes. Just killing intent. For a while, the purple mist began to gather in one place. Soon after, a small, red smoke escaped from Eugene's inventory. SSSSK. Smoke escaped from the fragment of the sword of Tatsuka. The red smoke and the purple smoke intertwined and began to take shape. It had no mass or energy, but it was something that was united by a killing intent greater than anything else. What is this? A small, purple doll the size of a palm. It was a samurai with a sword on his waist, looking like an errand boy. He opened his eyes and immediately looked around twice. Where is this? A small tower. Small tower. That was another name for Susanoo's dungeon in the Samgwajaja. It seemed that the name had first come from the small samurai in front of him. Does that mean this guy is Susanoo? It was an unlikely thought, but for now, that was the most likely possibility. Only then could he make sense of the killing intent that made his whole body tingle. That's right, I'm dead, Susanoo muttered as if he had finished understanding the situation after being dazed for a moment. Then he turned his gaze to Eugene. A small body. It seemed like it would disappear if he flicked it with his palm. He was small, and there was no energy to be felt. It was just smoke that had gathered together. However, the killing intent he felt from his thoughts made Eugene tense up. Did you bring the sword of Tatsuka? Yes, really. Susanoo's eyes twitched. That was all a small doll could do, even if it made a face. Eugene had experienced this level of killing intent several times before, even if it was enormous. He could withstand it. In fact, he even found it funny when the small samurai in front of him made a face. There was nothing to be afraid of. I guess you don't know who I am. Your name is Susanoo, one of the Samgwajaja, a master swordsman, a commander, and a necromancer. A murderer known in the tower. Your ranking when you were alive was 57th. Eugene recited information about Susanoo one after another. You died while fighting the Yamata no Orochi. Anyway, you're a great person. But I wonder why you want to be respected when you're living like that. At Eugene's words, Susanoo was dazed for a moment before raising the corners of his lips. Even though you know who I am, you're like that. There are all sorts of things after death. It was an interesting reaction. Perhaps if he had been Susanoo when he was alive, he would have cut Eugene down in one stroke. However, he did not have the strength to do so now. He was now just a thought with a barely formed shape. Respect is fine. I didn't leave my thoughts like this because I wanted that. Still, correct one of the things you said. Recalling the past, Susanoo appeared before Eugene and smiled his most joyful smile. It's not that kind. My life was the best. You're proud of killing so many. Eugene nodded. As expected, it was as he had heard. It's fortunate that you died early. What would have happened if Susanoo had been alive? Perhaps he would have been ranked among the first of the rankers that Eugene had to kill. It would have been quite tiring if there had been one more top high ranker at 57th place as an enemy. But you don't seem to be a ranker on our side. Where is that guy? Neither side. Eugene raised his player kit and showed him the number. Of course, I'm not a ranker either. What? Disappointment was evident in Susanoo's eyes as he checked the number. 21. That's all. Chapter 107. Are you going to talk about that subject? Susanoo's tone of voice changed. Just a moment ago, he was looking at Wu Jin with interesting eyes as if he was amused, but he suddenly looked at him with contempt. It was the reaction that he had expected. He was a battle maniac that even Asura would acknowledge, and not anyone else. He detests the weak and respects the strong. One thing is for sure. He didn't see the players in the lower floors as humans. It would be good enough if he didn't treat them like bugs. That's why he was famous for killing every player he sees. Then can't I had high expectations for nothing. Susanoo crossed his arms and shook his head. This is not a place where a bug like you can come and go. The monsters that live on the 21st floor are incomparable to the ones that are here. I know since I saw them earlier. Susanoo felt something was strange. He had forgotten after seeing the number 21 written on the player's kit, but there were vampire hyenas roaming outside this door. The vampire hyenas were the ones that protected the dungeon that he had designed. They were monsters that could be seen around the 40th floor, and there were quite a few of them. Don't you have any companions? Susanoo looked around. He was just a thought, so he couldn't feel any special energy or aura. No, I'm alone. Thud. Wu Jin started moving right away. Susanoo's appearance was new, but that was all. He was just a thought that wasn't even alive. He didn't want to deal with him any longer since he couldn't even use his physical strength properly. Swish. Susanoo followed behind Wu Jin. His expression was a little more interesting than before, as if he had changed his mind. I'll follow you. I can't help it since you have the fragment. Why? Because this dungeon was made that way. That's unique. Wu Jin answered Susanoo roughly and kept walking. The inside of the dungeon was quiet. At first, he thought it was a maze, but he could see small pieces of furniture scattered here and there, making it look like a huge house. Of course, it was awkward to call it a house since it was infinitely large. You're not a pure blood, are you? Susanoo kept talking. Where did you live? Where did you get the fragment? The fragment. It was referring to the fragment of the sword of Tatsuka. Wu Jin ignored his words and kept walking. He didn't want to keep talking to him about meaningless things, even if he was bored. It was annoying, and they were all just words that weren't worth answering. I'm really curious. If you tell me. Wu Jin looked back at Susanoo. Can you at least tell me the direction? The direction. The direction to the door or stairs to the next floor. Even if this is a maze-type dungeon, it's not difficult, but it takes too long, so I really hate it. No matter how large the sensory field is, it's impossible to grasp all the paths. If I'm lucky, I might be able to get through the first floor in a few hours, but if I'm unlucky, I might rot here for a day. The master who created the dungeon, Susanoo, must know the structure of the dungeon. At Yuan's words, Susanoo thought for a moment and nodded. Okay, I'll do that. Susanoo, who had been shaking his head, pointed his finger in one direction. The door is over there. If you keep walking in that direction while looking for the path, you will find the door to the next floor. That way. Yuan nodded. I see. Swish. He pulled out the sword that he had put away for a while after the fight with the vampire hyenas. Susanoo, who had given him a hint, asked again. Now answer the question I asked earlier. Where did you get that fragment? The test on the first floor, remember? The Colosseum. I got it there. Tisk, 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 tisk. Magic power gushes out through the quinae. Although he didn't use hell, enough power was transferred to the sword. I don't understand. You got that from a test on the first floor. In the last test of the Colosseum, that guy's head came out. Yuan turned his body and stood facing the blocked wall that Susanoo was pointing at, not the pierced left and right paths. Yamata no Orochi. What? Who? The question continued, but Yuan did not answer. Concentration was more important now. This isn't a real tower. The tower at the end of the world. Except for the wall that had collapsed on its own, it was possible to break through all the walls, which no one had ever been able to break before. A maze. A test where you have to find the set path. However, Yuan always found a different path. The path. Whoosh. The holy fire attached to the sword. Yuan swung his sword at the wall with all his might. I'll make it crack. The wall cracked with an explosive sound. Yuan swung his sword once more. Crash, thud, thud, thud. The wall collapsed. Yuan walked over the rising dust and swung his sword at the next wall. Crash, bang. Susanoo looked on in amazement as Yuan broke through the wall and started moving. He wasn't looking for a path, but making one as he went. It was just a thought, but his mind was getting complicated. Yamada no Orochi, a player on the 21st floor. No, if Yuan's answer was true, it meant that he had captured Orochi's head on the first floor. Susanoo couldn't believe that such a thing was possible. If he hadn't seen the scene unfolding before him, he might have laughed it off as a lie. Crash. He had already broken through 3 walls and created a path. That wasn't all. Kekaki, he. The undead appeared with an eerie laugh. Monsters in the form of spirits. They approached like smoke and wrapped around Yuan's body. At that moment, devour, pa Gigi. It seemed that he had misunderstood Yuan's words. The cold quin in Yuan's hand absorbed the spirit. What the heck is that? What kind of item is that? It was now beyond interesting and into the realm of bewilderment. He thought he knew everything about the tower, but he had been surprised several times in this short period of time. An item that absorbs monsters made of souls. Clack. Susanoo, who had been quietly watching Yuan make his way, had the corners of his mouth turned up. Interesting. The fun of seeing something new. Beyond that, he even felt his non-existent body flare up. Something to look forward to. It took only a little over an hour to clear the first floor. Level up. Agility has increased by 1. Stamina has increased by 1. Perception has increased by 1. He leveled up while clearing the first floor. It seemed that he had hunted quite a few monsters, and his experience points had almost reached the end. Next, the second and third floors. Yuan continued to clear the following floors and figured out the characteristics of Susanoo's dungeon. All of them are monsters with the spirit and undead attributes. Monsters made of souls were rare to see. The same went for the undead. No matter how big the difference was between having a physical body and not having one, their bodies also had souls. All of them, the souls of the dead. And it was obvious where their souls came from. Those who died to Susanoo. Susanoo is a master swordsman that even Asura would acknowledge. Not only that, he was also one of the best necromancers and death spirit users in the tower. And he was also the murderer who had killed the most people in the tower's long history. Did he gather the souls of all those he killed and create this tower? Yuan, who rarely got shaken up, felt goosebumps at this point. It felt like he was climbing a mountain made of countless corpses. He couldn't shake off the feeling that he was stepping on someone's corpse with every step he took. This feels dirty. What are you talking about? Yuan's head turned at his nonchalant question. He had ignored whatever he said until now, but this time it was hard to do so. You've become quite the apostle of justice. Justice. Yuan's brow furrowed. Was he really just? Strictly speaking, he could be considered so since he was moving to save the world. However, Yuan didn't think so. Some people couldn't overcome the guilt of having to hurt someone and ended up not being able to swing their swords in the end. They all died like that, and Yuan survived. He was not just. Everyone living in this world was evil. However, I've seen many bastards, but you're the first of your kind. Even Yuan had never met anyone like Susanoo before. You've seen a lot, huh? A kid who has only managed to climb up to the 21st floor. It seemed like he had misunderstood what Yuan had said. Even though it wasn't everything he was thinking, Yuan didn't bother correcting him. He didn't feel the need to. Yuan grabbed the doorknob with his slightly sharper fingertips and pulled it open. Kriak. The door opened, revealing a staircase. Yuan walked up the stairs and arrived on the next floor. You have arrived on the 10th floor. There were 10 rooms on the 10th floor. Each room was numbered from 1 to 10. Enter room 1 and defeat the corresponding enemy. The door to room 2 will open after clearing room 1. You can move to the next floor after clearing room 5. This was strange. If there were 10 rooms, why could he move to the next floor after clearing only 5 rooms? In that case, there was only one thing he could think of. It means that the difficulty of the 10th floor starts from room 6. Shall I tell you something? Susanoo's voice had a hint of laughter in it. Just as you thought, the ones here are the ones I killed when I was alive. Whether they were souls or undead, I collected them as I came across them. The oldest one here has probably been living as an undead for over 5,000 years. Yuan remained indifferent even after Susanoo's words. This was something he had already expected. There was no need to get worked up again for the same reason. The only difference from his expectations was that the time was much longer than he had thought. Did he think Yuan's reaction was calmer than he expected? Susanoo spoke to Yuan, who was heading to the first room, with a slight surprise. There is no way to save these guys. Not unless you're a necromancer or a shaman who's better than me. But at least, if you kill them, you can get out of here. He was urging Yuan to continue challenging up to the 10th room instead of stopping at the 5th room. What will you do? Are you just going to pretend you don't know? Or will you keep challenging? It was an obvious provocation. But there was no reason not to take it. Even if you didn't say that, I was planning to challenge it. Clank. The door to room 1 opened. Inside was a long-haired man with a haggard face. His face was so pale and sickly that he didn't seem human. Undead. The room was about 20 meters wide, which was enough space to fight. The undead in room 1 slowly raised its head when it saw the door open. Its face was devoid of any emotion. Perhaps this one, too, had been trapped in this narrow room for hundreds of years. You don't have to get up. Quote. An expression appeared on the undead's face for the first time as it was about to get up. As if to ask what he was talking about. Then, whoosh. Purple flames ignited on the undead's body. Holy fire. Sizzle. The flames clung to the undead's body. Its pale skin melted away, disappearing slowly from its feet up. The undead didn't scream. It couldn't feel pain in the first place. You have cleared room 1. Yu-1 turned around after confirming the undead's annihilation. Rest now. Yu-1's footsteps headed towards room 2. And at the same time, creak. In his right hand, the quinnie emitted a faint light. Chapter 108. 10 days passed. You have passed the 40th floor. For 10 days, Wu-Yun was engrossed in hunting. 4 floors a day. In total, he passed 50 floors. His level, which had barely increased in the lower floors, steadily rose. Susanoo's dungeon was an excellent dungeon, as good as any top-floor hunting ground. Plus, hell, absorbs grudges. An unknown message. Save me. No, kill me. I want to get out of here. Please. I don't want to suffer anymore. One by one, these were the voices he heard whenever he killed Susanoo's undead. Hundreds, thousands of years of accumulated grudges. And souls corrupted by it. As they seeped into Quine, Wu-Yun could hear them clearly. I'm getting tired. After reaching the 40th floor, the speed at which he climbed slowed down a bit. Hunting wasn't as fast as before. Wu-Yun had outstanding skills for his level, but Susanoo's dungeon was still difficult. Plus, this voice eats away at one's mental strength. It was the first time Wu-Yun had heard the voices of the dead. Wu-Yun was not a necromancer or a warlock. The more he listened to the grudges of the undead that Susanoo had controlled, the more Wu-Yun felt his mind being eaten away. What is all this? Did he gain the ability to hear the voices of the dead when he acquired Quine? He thought about it, but it didn't seem to be the case. It's a voice I've never heard before. And hearing the voices of the dead is something that only high-ranking necromancers like Susanoo can do. It was nearly impossible for him, who had no related skills. One thing that bothered him was the grudges of the souls that Quine had absorbed. I didn't know Quine had this function. What is he going to do with these grudges? He couldn't think of anything to use them for right now. If Wu-Yun had been a real necromancer, that would have been different, but he wasn't. In the first place, the fact that Quine had this function was information that not only Wu-Yun but also his other colleagues did not know. That glove has a special ability. Susanoo, who had been watching Wu-Yun for quite a long time, spoke after a long while. He had been quiet for a while, but it seemed that his mouth had been quite busy. Why aren't you using it properly? Well, is it a trump card or something? A trump card? Yeah, it seems to me that you're the same kind of guy. Why don't you use it and keep hiding it? Susanoo, who had been talking, swallowed a laugh when he saw Wu-Yun's expression. Oh, right, so, it wasn't because of a guilty conscience or anything. What are you talking about? You still can't use that item properly. Susanoo's gaze turned to Wu-Yun's right hand. A black glove. Quine. It was true that he hadn't used hell until now. But Wu-Yun didn't hear Susanoo's words as such. The same kind of guy. How do you use it properly? I don't know that either. You were just pretending to know. What? This guy, even if I tell you. A lot of complaints poured out, but Wu-Yun didn't listen to them. They were unnecessary words. The important thing was what he said before that. Use it properly. There were still many clues missing about Quine. Hades, who had used this item, was not very close to Wu-Yun, and he was the most veiled ranker among the 3 main gods of Olympus. Until now, Wu-Yun had only used Quine as an amplifying item to draw out mana. In fact, Quina was an excellent item just by itself. However, I still haven't been able to use this item properly. The attributes that the item Quina possesses. And the original owner of the item, Hades. It's not bad information. The fact that he could increase the efficiency of the item was definitely good news. He had no choice but to figure out the details himself, but he had a vague idea. Eugene looked up and stared at the ceiling. The ceiling that wouldn't break with his own strength. Perhaps, unless a high ranker similar in rank to Susanoo came, this ceiling wouldn't be able to be broken. No, maybe the tower itself was recognized as a dungeon that was perceived as a test and was receiving the system's calibration. If that was the case, even if the administrator came in person, they wouldn't be able to break it. It's going to take a long time. He roughly organized his thoughts. Eugene dusted himself off and stood up. Now it was time to go up again. A month after that, you have passed the 50th floor. Level up. Strength has increased by 1. Agility has increased by 1. Health has increased by 1. You have discovered Susanoo's first relic. You have acquired the clothes of the 4 spirits. He broke through the 50th floor and got his first reward. It was quite welcome news for Eugene, who had only been running while watching his experience and level increase. When he opened the box and held the clothes inside, Eugene almost cheered without realizing Susanoo. Clothes of the 4 spirits. Hash armor that has the protection of the elemental kings of fire, water, wind, and electricity. It has strong resistance to each element's power. Hash increased resistance to fire attribute. Hash increased resistance to water attribute. Hash increased resistance to wind attribute. Hash increased resistance to electricity attribute. Hash can further increase the resistance of the 4 attributes by reacting with mana. Simple but definite effects. An item with strong resistance to the powers of the 4 most commonly used attributes. In addition to that, it was a fraudulent item that increased resistance by infusing mana. It has the disadvantage of having weak physical resistance, but I can avoid weapons sufficiently with my senses. Flap. Eugene took off the flame technique clothes he was wearing and put them in his inventory. Then, right there, he changed into the dusty clothes of the 4 spirits. After that, an hour passed. Eugene took a step to head to the next floor. Isn't it strange? It was a voice he hadn't heard in a long time. Eugene ignored Susanoo's voice. It was a voice that was of no nutritional value, even if he listened to it. It clearly says that you're a player on the 21st floor in the player kit, but you fight like a veteran high ranker. Your skills are still far from a high ranker's though. Stop whining. You're not even a fly. Flicking his hand while covering his ear as if it was noisy, he looked like he was chasing away a fly. However, as if he was used to this kind of treatment, Susanoo continued speaking without much change in expression. Plus, you've definitely gotten stronger than when you first came in. Eugene's growth speed was surprising even to Susanoo, who was watching from the side. Every time his level went up 1 step, Eugene's abilities noticeably increased. It was a natural change. Eugene was already a top high ranker when it came to fighting, and he had fought against the outer gods. Battle sense. There were probably few beings in the tower that could match Eugene's current battle sense. The skills he had were needless to say. Wan, gigantification, holy fire, etc. There were numerous precious skills that even high rankers would covet. The same went for items. Quina and the Black Knight Sword, made using the Black Divine Stone, were items that Hades would have set his eyes on and coveted if he knew about them. In other words, it meant that the engine already built into him was sufficiently excellent. The problem was just the body that moved it. Thanks to that, the more his level and stats increased, his growth was not additive but exponential. Just what are you? That was the question that had been lingering in Susanoo's mind all this time. Yuan still didn't answer. Susanoo closed his mouth again. He only opened his mouth again when Yuan reached the 60th floor. This one will be quite difficult. Quote. For the first time, he was interested in what Susanoo had to say. Difficult, he said. It wasn't something Susanoo would say. Maybe he was adjusting to Yuan's standards, but it was surprising to hear such words come out of Susanoo's mouth. What kind of guy is he? Are you interested now? His lips curled up into a grin. Susanoo closed his mouth. He seemed to be saying that since you didn't answer me, I won't answer you either. If you're not going to talk, I have nothing to say either. Yuan smacked his lips in regret. If it was really a dangerous floor, it wouldn't be a bad idea to get some hints from Susanoo. If he didn't give an answer, he would have no choice but to go and see for himself. Thud, creak, he climbed up the stairs and opened the door. Like the doors on the other floors, it was old and rusty. You have arrived on the 60th floor. The door opened, and a message was heard as he took a step inside. Yuan first looked around the interior of the floor with his eyes. Unlike the other floors, which were made up of various backgrounds, the 60th floor was empty. There was really nothing there. Not even a single rock or stone. There was no furniture or walls. It was literally an empty space. There's really nothing. Yuan, who had been looking around, headed forward for the time being. If there was nothing, all he had to do was go to the door leading to the next floor. Then, there would surely be something guarding the door. As expected, there it is, far away, something so small that it looked like a dot could be seen. It was quite a distance away. It must have been a few kilometers. Yuan used his heavenly eye to confirm the figure of the opponent. A knight. It was a knight sitting on the floor. A knight wearing heavy full-plate mail, with his head covered by a helmet. As he got closer, the knight seemed to have noticed Yuan and slowly raised his head. Creak. The rusty armor creaked as it moved, making an unpleasant sound. Yuan, who had approached, looked down at the seated knight. He was still not moving. It was probably because the distance was not close enough. Is this guy the difficult one? Clack. The knight began to straighten his knees and stand up. Yuan watched him and swung his sword. There was no need to wait for him. Boom. The sword strike imbued with holy fire swept the ground at the knight's feet. But, swish, the knight's sword, the only thing that was not rusty, blocked Yuan's sword strike. Even in a sitting position, very quickly and accurately. Definitely. Yuan watched the knight stand up and regripped his sword. It's dangerous. The blue light emanating from the helmet was ominous. It was clearly just an undead, but it felt like the aura of the living was still being transmitted. It was clearly different from the undead he had met so far. It felt like he had met a living being for the first time since entering the tower. Just like that, the knight raised his sword and stood up completely. That moment, Death Knight, defeat King Arthur. The identity of the knight standing before him was revealed through a message. Arthur. Yuan's eyes widened. Arthur. Chapter 109. Arthur. He was definitely his colleague, Merlin's oldest friend, and the guild leader of the mid-level guild, Round Table. The King of Britain, the King of Knights, the Master of the Knights of the Round Table. A genius. There were many modifiers that could be placed before him, but whenever Merlin thought of Arthur, he said this. The first time I saw him, he was still an immature little rookie player. Friend. Even though there was a large difference in their ages, Merlin considered him a friend. He was a natural with the sword, and he was a real catch. His colleagues trusted him a lot, and more than anything, his loyalty was stronger than anyone I knew. Every time he thought of his old friend, fine wrinkles deepened around Merlin's eyes. Arthur. The only friend in the tower that Merlin acknowledged. I miss you, friend. He had heard so many stories about Arthur that he was sick of them. All of Merlin's old stories were centered around him. However, he suddenly stopped coming back from a hunt one day. But, he was here. Arthur, who had died at the hands of Susano, became an undead and was trapped in the tower. Creak. The Night King. No, Death Knight. Arthur moved his body. Arthur approached Eugene with a fierce glare in his eyes. Thud. One step. Thud. 2 steps. Whir. Blue mana gathered on Arthur's sword. Mana that was chillingly cold. It was ice attribute mana. Spot. Crackle. The air where Eugene was standing froze along with the sword strike. The water vapor in the air turned into frost and fell down like snow. Eugene jumped up and looked at Arthur's sword. The famous sword, Excalibur. Even though he became an undead, he still has his items. Well, a high ranker like Susano might not have noticed Excalibur. Rather, he might have left the items as they were in order to make Arthur an undead and bring out his abilities to the fullest. Arthur was a high ranker similar to Theseus when he was alive. He might not have become a high ranker, but according to Merlin, his rank was rising quickly. Swish, crackle, sword strikes flew towards Eugene, who had flown up. The mana imbued with the attribute of ice was almost as fast as the mana of the wind attribute. Hermes' footsteps, swish. Fortunately, Eugene had another way to move in the air. After dodging the sword strikes twice in a row, Eugene landed behind Arthur. Normally, I wouldn't be able to beat Arthur, who has become an undead. Swish. Arthur's sword, which had turned around, flew towards him. Should he dodge it? Eugene, who was considering his next move, swung his sword. Holy fire. Magic sword. Whoosh. A sword imbued with purple flames. Clang. The swords with 2 opposing attributes clashed. The chilling cold of the ice attribute was devoured by the flames and lost its coldness. Fortunately, the attributes weren't bad. Fortunately, the compatibility wasn't bad. I feel my body getting dull. But right now, it's not Susanoo who's moving Arthur. Clang, clang, clang. He pushes back the force imbued in the sword. He's just a dead ghost. The power of Susanoo, who died hundreds of years ago, couldn't be as strong as when he was alive. Naturally, the power of the undead would have to weaken as the power of the master controlling the undead weakened. Clang. Arthur's sword, Excalibur, was struck upwards by Yuan's sword, which dug into his chest. He intended to pierce his body in one breath. However, boom, suddenly, a transparent barrier intervened between Yuan's sword and Arthur. He succeeded in piercing the barrier, but much of the force was lost. Is it ice? A barrier of ice harder than steel. Ice made of mana wasn't something that could be easily pierced. Arthur was originally a knight with excellent defense rather than attack power. A knight who protects the round table, or so they said. But that didn't mean that Arthur's sword was dull. Clang. The two swords crossed. The sword aimed at the vital point was indeed sharp. Arthur's sword, which flew while scattering cold air, even grazed Yuan's neck a few times. A speed that was difficult to follow with the eyes. It wasn't irregular or simple, but it was powerful and fast. Indeed, the title of the King of Knights wasn't given for nothing. He was displaying the swordsmanship that was like the standard of knights, almost perfectly. Drip. His shoulder was slightly cut. His brow furrowed. I see why only this guy is here. Arthur's skill was indeed considerable. It was the first time Yuan, who hadn't received any major injuries since entering Susanoo's dungeon, had been injured. Although there was only one of them, Arthur was more than enough to call himself the middle boss of this dungeon. Rustle. Numerous ice blades were scattered in all directions. It's difficult to just avoid this. Sensory zone is activated. Fire eyes reads the path. The manifestation of sensory zone and fire eyes. The space where Arthur was standing seemed as clear as the palm of his hand. And, squirm, as if it had been waiting, 10 ice blades began to move. The trajectory of their movement was clearly visible to his eyes. Yuan's toes moved. Swish, clang, clang, clang. The blades pierced the floor, failing to pierce Yuan. Whoosh. At the same time, a cold chill washed over Yuan like a huge wave. I can't avoid this. It wasn't the kind of skill that could be avoided. It was a skill that covered a wide area, like a huge wave, and struck almost simultaneously with the ice blades pouring down. The range was too wide. Yuan crouched down with his sword raised. Crackle, creak, creak. Yuan's body began to freeze white. His body rapidly cooled down. It felt similar to when he had eaten the ice crystal. As expected, body temperature is dropping rapidly. Status effect. Frostbite begins. Clothing of the four spirits resists the cold. He felt his body growing numb. However, thanks to the effect of the four spirits' clothing, his body did not freeze completely. His body shivered from the cold. He looked up and saw Arthur's sword piercing his neck. Weaken their movements with ice attribute mana and skills, then finish them off in close combat. It was a simple pattern, but it was perfect without any unnecessary details. Despite becoming an undead, it seemed like he still remembered the swordsmanship and fighting techniques he had honed when he was alive. From his opponent's point of view, Wu Jin found it hard to believe that he was an undead. Well done. At that moment, whoosh, your body temperature is rising rapidly. Holy fire, resists the status condition, frostbite. Resistance successful, flames pushed away the cold. His frozen body melted and his strength returned. Arthur's first attempt to incapacitate his opponent had failed. Next, clang, clank, the power of the giant dwells in your arms. The stamina status temporarily replaced with strength. Your stamina is low, partial gigantification is in progress. The muscles in his arms swelled up. With the strength in his right arm, Wu Jin pointed his sword at Arthur, who was running towards him. This time, it'll be different. Clang, different. Noticing the unusual change, Arthur quickly retrieved his sword and took a defensive stance. A curtain of ice surrounded his body like armor, and on top of that, countless sharp thorns made of ice piled up on his body. An armor of thorns made of ice. However, Wu Jin swung his sword without hesitation. Clang, clang, clang. The sword pierced through the curtain of ice. The flames surrounding the sword melted the ice, and the sword slowly reached the armor. Clang. Unlike Excalibur, the armor surrounding Arthur's body was already badly worn and could no longer function as armor. Slice. Wu Jin flew past Arthur and behind his back. Thud. Along with the armor, the lower part of Arthur's shoulder was cut off and fell to the ground. Wu Jin turned around and looked at Arthur. From his shoulder to his side, His body had been half cut off along with his sword, but he was holding his sword again with his left hand. Even if he was an undead, he wouldn't be able to fight anymore with just one left arm. How pitiful. Flick. Wu Jin bent down and cut off Arthur's left arm, which was picking up the sword. Arthur, who had lost both arms, looked up at Wu Jin. At that moment, swish, whir, thud, Wu Jin grabbed his neck and slammed Arthur's body into the ground. Arthur, who had lost both arms. Moreover, Wu Jin's strength, which had been strengthened by gigantification, was not something that even Arthur, who had returned to his former life, could easily shake off. He had lost all means and strength to fight back. Phew. Convinced that the fight was over, Wu Jin finally took a deep breath. Having confirmed the end of the fight, Wu Won exhaled in relief. Lancelot betrayed Britain. Even though the fight was short, it was quite tense. If the armor Arthur was wearing hadn't been old, I wouldn't have been able to cut off his arm in one blow. If that had happened, the fight would have probably been longer. The result wouldn't have been any different though. Creak, creak. Even though he was overpowered by Wu Won, Arthur continued to struggle. He tried to shake off Wu Won by putting strength into his restrained neck and shaking his upper body and legs. It was futile. Wu Won looked at Arthur with pitiful eyes and summoned holy fire. You can stop fighting now. Whoosh. Flames seeped through the gaps in Arthur's armor, following the tip of his hand. The flames that seeped into the armor burned Arthur's bones, beginning the purification. Crackle, sizzle. His body, burned by the flames, turned into smoke and flew into the air. And along with it, the Quinn emitted light as always. Hell is absorbing the grudge. Swoosh. The Quinn sucked up Arthur's grudge. A grudge that had been frozen for over 1,000 years, cold to the touch. Wu Won muttered as he watched Arthur's body turn to white ash and disappear. I wish Merlin could have seen this too. That was when it happened. Merlin. Wung. A voice came from the grudge that was being sucked into the Quinn. Wu Won quickly covered the Quinn with his cold left hand. Then, the voice continued. Did you say Merlin? Arthur. It was the first time he had heard this voice, but he definitely knew Merlin. Other than Susano, this was the first time he had heard the voice of the dead. There were cases where the undead had self-awareness, but Arthur was currently in a state where he didn't even have the shell of the undead. And the only existences that could hear the voices of such beings were a very limited number of existences, such as necromancers or spiritualists. You're a necromancer too. He must have misunderstood after seeing Wu Won hear his voice. Not really, but, Wu Won shook his head as he tried to think of another way to deny it. He couldn't think of a way to make this situation, which he didn't understand himself, understandable with words. Let's just say I am. He wondered if Arthur would despise necromancers. After all, he must have been suffering inside here for at least 1,000 years. However, Arthur's next words were completely different from his worries. Do you know Merlin? He must have been curious because Wu Won had mentioned Merlin's name. Yes, a little. If you're a necromancer, can you let me meet Merlin? If you grant me that one wish, I will sign a contract to serve you as your subordinate for eternity. He had lived his entire life as an undead anyway. He must have had quite a lot of grudges and must have been miserable, but he was still volunteering to become an undead again. Why would you go that far? I have something I need to tell him. Something he needs to tell him. It was probably Arthur's old grudge that had kept him from returning after death. Arthur's voice, which continued, was filled with strength that was hard to believe came from the dead. Lancelot betrayed Britain. Chapter 110. Lancelot. I've heard the name a lot. The new master of the Round Table Guild. He climbed the tower with Arthur 100 years ago, became a high ranker, and brought the Round Table to the brink of becoming a large guild. And yet Lancelot betrayed him. Aren't you surprised? Despite the shocking story, Arthur asked in surprise when Yu Won didn't react much. I guess you don't know who Lancelot is. Well, the Round Table might have disappeared by now. The Round Table hasn't disappeared. Rather, it's grown much larger than before. Oh, it was a story from the outside world that he had heard in thousands of years. Arthur's voice brightened a little. But only for a moment. Then Lancelot must still be there. Yes, I must hurry even more. Arthur's voice came to life. Will you listen to me? Even if you say that. Yu Won sighed as if he was troubled. I'm not a necromancer. What? I think this item is the reason why I can hear your voice. I don't have a way to resurrect you as an undead like a necromancer. That can't be. Arthur's voice shook slightly as if he was in despair. Yu Won hesitated for a moment at Arthur's reaction and then nodded. I'll try my best, though. There might be a way. A way? There is. I was thinking about getting a related skill anyway since I've collected so many souls, so it's not bad. He was going to meet Merlin sooner or later anyway. There was no need to go out of his way, and it wasn't bad for Yuan if Arthur became his ally. More than anything else, I had to deal with Lancelot someday anyway. It wasn't just for Arthur. He couldn't just stand by and watch as the Round Table in Britain became more corrupted. Furthermore, if he could bring Lancelot down, bigger fish might follow. Perfect timing. Yuan nodded. I'll accept your request. Thank you. You have accepted Arthur's request. Starting, Purification of Britain. Upon completion, you will gain the complete obedience of the Night King Arthur. You have obtained the Night King's soul. A message popped up. It was unexpected. He thought it was just a simple request, but he didn't think it would become a message that was part of the system. Is this a hidden piece too? It had been over 1,000 years since Arthur had died. Perhaps he had existed in Susano's dungeon for a long time, becoming part of the system. Purification of Britain. It was probably a quest related to the traitor Lancelot. Complete obedience. It was a reward that seemed vague at first glance, but it was enough to satisfy Yuan. Not bad. 2 things were needed to summon the undead, a strong body and a soul. However, that alone wasn't enough to summon a perfect undead. In order to use 100% of their power from when they were alive, the undead had to choose their master themselves and be completely loyal. In that sense, the reward for this quest was meaningful enough. Swish. As he removed his covered hand, Arthur's soul was sucked into the quinine. It was the first soul Yuan had obtained. Yuan, who had finished the fight, picked up Arthur's sword, Excalibur, that had fallen to the ground. What will that grandfather Merlin think? He felt a bit strange. If he was lucky enough to get a skill related to necromancy, Merlin would be able to reunite with Arthur. But would he? What would he think when he saw Arthur as an undead? But I can't just not let them meet. Merlin had wanted to meet Arthur no matter what. In fact, he had even searched for various necromancers in every corner of the tower to meet Arthur. In fact, he even went out to find several commanding wizards located in every corner of the tower to meet Arthur. However, I heard that his power weakens just as much, and that weakened clone was the Sun Ogong from just now. Also, Arthur also had something he needed to tell Merlin. Preventing the two from meeting was never a good choice. It ended up being more bland than I thought. Susano, who was watching the fight from behind, muttered with regret. I thought he was a decent guy, though. Did you kill Arthur by accident? Susano's lips curled up at Yuan's question. Arthur's death and disappearance. There were many unanswered questions about it. In particular, the fact that Susano had killed Arthur was something that Yuan had learned for the first time. Susano was a belligerent rancor. He had no qualms about killing and had a violent personality. It wouldn't be strange for him to have met Arthur by chance, killed him, and turned him into his undead. However, the timing was too clever to be considered an accident. Well, Susano did not answer Yuan's question. Yuan and Susano, neither of them ever gave each other the answers they wanted for free. Once you reach the top, I'll answer that question. What on earth is at the top? I'll find out when I get there. Yuan, who had put Arthur's legacy, Excalibur, into his inventory, began to climb the tower again. Time passed. It had been 3 months since Yuan had stopped participating in the outside tests. The Ranking Management Bureau, located on the 50th floor. Thump, thump, the administrators working there rarely trembled. It was because of the sudden appearance of a rancor from outside. Hey, anything else you're curious about? The administrators hurriedly thought about finishing their work and sending the man in front of them away. The Ranking Management Bureau was designated as an inviolable area unrelated to guilds, but the man was not one to care about such things. His eyes were full of curiosity. The man turned his head and asked, "Where is this guy from? Where is he now?" In an instant, the bodies of the people in the Management Bureau stiffened. I thought he came to check the rankings on the lower floors after a long time, but he's asking for this kind of information. No one, not even the large guilds, had the authority to view a player's unique information. I can't tell you that. Creak. Someone opened the door and came in. He was short, reaching only up to the waist, and had a face that looked about 10 years old, but the other administrators bowed their heads to him. Hey, errand boy, I'm the director now, show some respect. The director of the Ranking Management Bureau. He was also the right-hand man of the administrator who ruled over a floor. He was the one that even rankers trembled before. However, instead of being afraid of him, the man raised his energy. Rumble, rumble, the room was filled with heavy air. The administrators shut their mouths and held their breath. If they took even one breath, it felt like the air would rush into their lungs and turn their bodies upside down. The ground shook slightly. As the man raised his energy, the director also raised his strength. You're not even the main body, but you're trying to fight the management bureau. The man, Sun Ogong, stared at the director for a moment. He soon turned around and left the management bureau. It was a ridiculous request in the first place. He wanted them to confirm the identity of a player. It was a privilege only for administrators, and it was information that even large guilds could not request. Thud, thud, the spot where Sun Ogong had been. Phew, phew, huff, the administrators exhaled the breath they had been holding. Was that a clone? Not the main body, Sun Ogong. As a high ranker in the top ranks, it was known that he could create dozens or hundreds of clones. However, I heard that his powers weakened just as much, and the weakened body was the Goku that was just here. If that guy was the main body, it wouldn't have been me, but the administrator that would have come here. The administrator had to come here in person. That meant that even if the head of the institute came here in person, they wouldn't be able to do anything about Goku. It also meant that they had to be at least an administrator to stop him. That's right. In any case, other than information related to the rankings, we can't reveal any other information. Even if it's just a trivial piece of information. The Ranking Management Institute not only determined the rankings of the rankers, but also recorded the results of each floor's test. The reason for this was because they measured the rankings based on those records. That meant that the Ranking Management Institute was the one that had all the records on the players. That was why the large guilds always listened to what the Management Institute said and did. They were known to have all the information on the tower. However, of course, the head of the institute's gaze was fixed on the person that appeared on the screen. We don't have anything to tell you either. Name, Kim Yu-won. Origin, affiliation, ranking, grade, E. Potential, S. Name, face, and other information. It was the most basic information, but the institute hadn't been able to properly figure it out. The grade was meaningless since it was given according to the player's floor, and the ranking wasn't measured because he wasn't a ranker. His affiliation hadn't been revealed. That much was understandable. His origin is unknown, The head of the institute thought about other rankers. This is the first time this has happened. He had been running errands for thousands of years. After working under the administrator and entering the institute, he had seen countless rankers. Among them were top high rankers who called themselves the absolutes of the tower, and rankers who had just barely become rankers and were struggling at the bottom of the rankings. However, none of them were players whose origins were unknown. According to the investigation, he must have come to the tower from a world called Earth. Why isn't his origin showing up in the information? There was no way that the system would make a mistake. It was an absolute power that never changed. There was a reason why the administrators were interested in this guy. He wasn't just a player with good test scores. He was an existence that the system couldn't find the origin of. In the 11th floor's test, he tied with the test supervisor. In the 20th floor's test, he obtained the Stone of the Sea and went into hiding. He wasn't just passing the tests with high scores. Kim Yu-won's actions were unique in the tower's history. Now that I think about it, he's been stuck on the 21st floor for almost 3 months. Until then, he had been hearing news about Kim Yu-won almost every day. But was he going to stop climbing the tower? Yu-won hadn't shown himself for a long time after the 21st floor. It's not weird for him to be satisfied and stop here. Most players gave up halfway and didn't become rankers. Taking a test meant risking your life. Even if Yu-won stopped halfway, it wouldn't be weird. But it's still disappointing. Just 3 months ago, he seemed like he wasn't going to stop. Tisk. The head of the institute took out a cigarette from his pocket and lit it. There had never been a player who had fought and won against a ranker in the 10th floor section. Even the heavenly demon, Cheonma, had only managed to defeat the Chimera creator on the 50th floor. He had become a high ranker in the shortest amount of time after becoming a ranker just a few years ago. Was it because he had been doing this job for so long that he had developed an occupational disease? He suddenly thought this. If this guy becomes a ranker, what rank would he be? Chapter 111, Clang. The blade that was aimed at his back was deflected and sent flying. At that moment, he felt a sharp presence above his head. Sensory zone is activated. Whoosh, he could feel the presence of everything around him with his skin. However, despite that, the presence was small and stealthy like a little mouse. Thud, Yu-won's body twisted to the side. The blade grazed past him. At that moment, giant strength fills your arm. Gulp. His left arm swelled up, and Yuan's fist shot out. Bang, clang, there was the sound of bones shattering. The assassin that had appeared above his head flew far away and crashed into the wall. Boom, thud, the assassin, whose bones were broken all over his body, collapsed. He must have been wearing some pretty tough armor, as his fist that had swung the punch felt sore. Yuan spoke to Susanoo, who must have been watching him from somewhere. You planned this shitty test well. Sweat dripped from Yuan's forehead. He couldn't see well because it was so dark around him, but the bags under his eyes were dark, and his focus was slightly wavering. He was exhausted and tired. More than anything, he desperately needed to sleep. The 99th floor. It was a place he had reached after running hard for 3 months. The content of the 99th floor's test was simple. Survive for 10 days. 10 days. It was quite a long time. After the 40th floor, each floor wasn't easy, and it took several days to clear one floor, but there was no place that took 10 days. He was short on time, but it was nice because it was simple. There was nothing complicated about it. However, the problem was these guys. Swish, boom, a blade flew from the side. Thanks to activating sensory zone, it wasn't difficult to dodge. However, the problem was that he couldn't relax because of the constant attacks. They stabbed me without showing themselves. And, Yuan's gaze turned downward. Rumble, screech, a huge mouth rose from the ground, turning it upside down. Slash, chomp, the monster collapsed, its head cut off, losing its strength. It was an unknown undead monster with a head that was about twice the size of its body. There are guys like this mixed in between the undead assassins. The monsters attacked him without rest. In other dungeons, he would have been able to get some sleep, but not here. If he relaxed even a little bit, the monsters that had been hiding their presence would appear, so he couldn't rest at all. For 10 whole days, he didn't rest once. Yuan continued to stay tense and prepare for surprise attacks. Let's finish this quickly and get some sleep. Yuan lifted his head. On the high ceiling, he could see the undead that were hidden in the darkness, glaring at him. The field of vision from the heavenly eye brightly lit up any darkness. Also, sensory zone, which he was using at the same time, detected even the slightest twitch of a muscle, no matter how well they hid their presence. Even for Yuan, it was tough to maintain these two skills at the same time for 10 days. But it didn't matter, it would all be over soon anyway. Remaining time, 001, 724. A little over an hour left. Considering that he had endured for 10 days, 240 hours, the end was really just around the corner. He couldn't lose focus after coming this far. Did they know that he didn't have much time left? The monsters that had been scattered around all gathered together. They're only popular at times like this. Yuan sighed and spoke to the dozens of assassins that were stuck to the ceiling. What are you doing? Clank, clang. The assassins pulled out iron weapons and bone fragments from their bosoms. Aren't you going to kill me? At the same time as he said that. Rumble, the assassins poured down on Yuan like rain. Gulp, heavenly eye reads the path. Level up. Strength increased by 1. Strength increased by 1. Senses increased by 1. It seemed like he had heard some rather welcome news. He even felt a bit lighter, perhaps because his stamina had increased along with his level. You have passed the 99th floor trial. However, after the battle was over, Yuan immediately collapsed to the floor and fell asleep. Not having slept for 10 days was akin to torture. One day, Yuan slept soundly for an entire day. The floor he had cleared the trial on was the last one anyway. There were no more assassins lurking around him. After waking up from a peaceful sleep, Yuan first looked around him. The door is. He distinctly remembered seeing a firmly locked door leading to the next floor. It's over there. Yuan yawned long and got up from his spot. Susanoo was nowhere to be seen. He knew that he had slept for quite a while. He thought Susanoo would be making a huge fuss since it was the top floor, but he was nowhere to be found. I leveled up. He had finally leveled up after climbing several floors. His level, which had barely increased after reaching level 90, had finally gone up by 1. Yuan checked his status. Name, Kim Yuan. Level, 96. Strength, 99. Agility, 93. Stamina, 98. Senses, 99. Mana, 102. He had leveled up quite a bit. His mana stat had also increased by 2, and most of his stats, except for agility, were now in the triple digits. In particular, the fact that both his strength and senses had increased at the same time when he leveled up just now was quite welcome news. Just one more now. It was unfortunate, but with this level and these stats, he had achieved the first objective of entering Susanoo-Oh's dungeon. Level and stats, and most importantly, the items he could acquire in the dungeon. It had taken a lot of hard work and time, but he had gained just as much in return. The problem is, Yu-won looked at the wide-open door. It's terrifying to go in. After passing the 90th floor, the trials had become increasingly difficult. Rankers like Arthur had appeared as undead, and he had faced all sorts of bizarre trials. It seemed like Susanoo had put a lot of effort into creating this dungeon. After all, his incredible relics were hidden throughout the dungeon, even surprising Yu-won. My stamina is full. He didn't have any major injuries. There were a few cuts and bruises, but thanks to the pitch-black environment of the 99th floor, his stamina had recovered quickly. He had also gotten enough sleep. He had rested enough, and his condition was perfect. Phew, he let out a long breath and relaxed his tension. He had come a long way. Tension that he usually didn't feel was gripping his heart. It wasn't because he didn't know what was ahead. It was because he knew what awaited him. He went up the stairs and headed to the next floor. His chest felt tight. Ha ha ha. The first thing he heard was laughter. Was he getting used to spirits now? He could definitely sense the presence of the dead, who should have no physical strength or energy. Laughter. It was a common reaction from spirits who had been around for a long time and had gone mad. Creepy. The door to the next floor could be seen at the top of the stairs. That was where the laughter was coming from. So many spirits were waiting for him. Among them were some spirits that were constantly bursting into tears. Creak, screech. He opened the door that had been locked for so long. As soon as the door opened, a message rang out, as expected. You have entered the final floor. You will obtain Susanoo-Oh's relic if you pass. Until now, Yu-won had obtained various relics of Susanoo-Oh while passing through his dungeon. The clothes of the four great spirits and the Excalibur that Arthur had were all relics he thought he had obtained by passing through his dungeon. But that didn't seem to be the case. All the items obtained so far were used by the undead that Susanoo commanded. That was Yu-won's mistake. None of the items Yu-won had obtained were items that Susanoo had used when he was alive. Although Excalibur was a great item, it was a little lacking compared to the Black Knight sword that Yu-won used. Comparing it to Susanoo's sword was almost insulting. Thud. Footsteps echoed more clearly on the narrow staircase. The souls scattered everywhere silently watched Yu-won. Yu-won looked around the interior of the 100th floor. It felt similar to the floor where he had met Arthur. The stage of the test was also similar. A wide floor with nothing on it. The only difference was that the ceiling, which had been only about 10 meters on the other floors, was so high that it couldn't be seen here. Creak. It was a space where sounds echoed unusually loudly. Yu-won turned his head at the sound of something moving. It was definitely small enough to look like a dot, but the sound was clear. Creepy. Goosebumps rose on his body. For a moment, it felt like the surroundings were going to be covered in ice. The cries of the souls, the coldness, everything felt as sharp as a blade. Thud. Yu-won started walking again. He moved slowly, calmly releasing the tension that had been tightly bound during that time. As he got closer to the dot that was far away, its appearance finally became visible. Squeak. The dot turned out to be an undead sitting on a giant chair. The chair was big, too big. It was a simple chair with no patterns, but it was big enough for even a giant of considerable size to sit on. And the one sitting on it, from what he could see, was a death knight like Arthur. A skeletal knight wearing thin, purple shoulder armor. The guy was wriggling and moving little by little. Clank. It overlapped with the situation when he had fought Arthur. But unlike then, Yu-won didn't move rashly. He could see the thin sword clutched in the death knight's hand. Clank. The death knight raised its head. Empty, pitch-black eyes stared at Yu-won. They were definitely out of focus, but Yu-won felt like he had made eye contact with it. Should I make the first move? He slowly drew up his mana, maintaining a moderate level of tension. Judgment was not passed. Then, that's the guy. A familiar voice was heard. A voice delivered to his head through Quinette. It was Arthur's. I know. Souls gathered around the death knight. Tens of thousands of souls clung to the tip of his sword and disappeared. Clack. The moment the death knight finally straightened its knees and tried to get up. Holy fire. Whoosh. Boom. Yu-won's sword was drawn, and in an instant, it emitted purple flames. He had exploded all the mana he had been slowly drawing up along with the sword strike. Whoosh. Thick flames blazed on the chair. For a moment, his vision was obscured by the flames. Did I get him? Don't do that. It was an ominous line. Whenever someone said something like this, it felt like they definitely hadn't died, or if they had, they would come back to life. He didn't expect to defeat it in one go. He would have been satisfied if he could just inflict a small wound, maybe even take one of its legs or arms. But, clack, clack, the Death Knight walked out of the flames. Its face, which had been nothing but bones without any flesh, now had about half of its flesh attached. The skeleton opened its mouth. It's hotter than I thought. I guess it's not an ordinary fire. It spoke as if it knew Yuan well. He had been worried about it, but it turned out to be true. The worst possible opponent he could imagine had appeared before him. Defeat the Death Knight, Susanoo. Chapter 112. What are you anyway? Are you actually a rancor? A half-assed Death Knight with gigantism and an unknown flame. You're incredibly unusual. Susanoo, one of the 3 noble children and a high ranker at 57th place. A long time ago, he was a powerhouse that shook the tower. Clank, that man, became a half-assed Death Knight and stood before Yuan. There's not much known about Susanoo's dungeon. Of course, it's obvious that none of us rankers are from the 3 noble children. In some ways, Susanoo's dungeon was an adventure. A dungeon with a lack of information. There was only information about the time it was cleared and the ranker who cleared it, and there was almost no information about the inside. But even so, Yuan looked at Susanoo who was standing before him. He actually made himself the boss of a dungeon. The more souls he absorbed from the 100th floor, the clearer Susanoo's face became. Half of his face now had flesh, and half of his original face was showing. Why is that? You're frozen stiff. I was actually quite looking forward to this. His lips twitched. He was probably smiling. It was just that only half of his face was showing, so his expression wasn't clear. Honestly, I didn't think you'd actually make it this far. Susanoo's shoulders shook. The hand that was holding the sword trembled, and the pitch of his voice changed every now and then. So do a good job. Don't disappoint me. You could tell with just a few words. Why this guy left behind a dungeon when he died? Artifacts and legacy. He didn't seem like the kind of person who cared much for the 3 noble children, nor did he seem like a great person who would worry about them even after his death. Did he want to leave a trace of himself behind? No. Susanoo wasn't the kind of person who would care about such vanity. There was only one reason why he created the dungeon. Simply because he wanted to fight more, even in this way. He created a dungeon and used the protection of the system to hold on to death. He's clever. The only way to hold on to death was to become undead. However, if you became undead, you couldn't help but be controlled by a necromancer, and there was currently no known way to become undead on your own. There were stories of some of the demons becoming liches, but they were just another kind of ghost that had consumed flesh. It was known that there was currently no way to make yourself a complete undead. But still, unstable, flames. Yuan's eyes burned red. The heavenly demon understands the essence. He could see it clearly. An unstable, wavering soul. You could tell from the fact that only half of his face was there. It was different from what he had originally planned. Even with the protection of the system, an undead without a master can't last forever. Undead were beings that could only be maintained if they had a master to supply them with mana and restrain their soul. However, not only Susanoo, but all of the undead that existed in the dungeon were without a master. They were only barely being maintained by the power of Susanoo's skill and the protection of the system. An unstable soul clinging to a rotten body that has long since died. That's what you are. The skeleton that had been gradually gaining flesh stopped regenerating at some point. That was it. That was the extent of Susanoo's preparations. In the end, he was just the boss of this dungeon, not Susanoo, the 57th ranker. The more I look at you, the more curious I get. He heard a voice by his ear. Susanoo, who had been talking in front of him just a moment ago, appeared right next to him in a single step. How did a guy who just barely passed the 20th floor get this far? And how do you know so much about necromancers, something that less than 10 people in the tower know about? A calm voice. Even though he could have easily circled around and attacked in an instant, he didn't seem to have any intention of doing so. Instead, he looked at Yuan as if he was observing him more closely. Rather, he watched Wu-Won as if he was observing him up close. His hand movements seemed leisurely and slow at first glance, but the tip of his sword was so fast that it was difficult to follow with the eye. Wu-Won's head turned to the side. As their eyes met, the corners of Susanoo's mouth rose. Are you not reacting, or are you not doing it? You talk more than you see. A mumbled reply, but that answer was enough. I knew it, this is it. Perhaps he could have reacted sufficiently. Wu Wen had already used wand to see Susanoo's feet and used sensory field to raise his senses to the maximum. I don't know what it is, but I might be able to figure it out if I fight. The tip of Susanoo's sword began to move. It seemed that the anticipation for the fight that had been suppressed by curiosity had raised its head. At that moment, I'm not a rancor. Wu Wen's mouth opened. For now, it was still a mumbled answer. However, it was like the first clue to Susanoo's curiosity. What kind of being is Wu Wen? From which world did he come, and if he was a pureblood, who and where was he? How did he become so strong? Then you were a rancor in the past. It was an absurd guess. A player who has climbed to the top of the tower once must become a rancor. Even if they come down the tower again, it doesn't change. A player who was once a rancor. That is something that is impossible without going back in time. I wonder if you're curious. The corners of Wu Wen's mouth went up. At that expression, Susanoo's expression turned cold. Wu Wen's expression felt like he was laughing at him. How dare you? Let's make one condition before we fight. Susanoo, who was about to draw his sword as if he was going to raise his fighting spirit, made a strange expression. A condition. The winner asks a question and the loser answers. Anything. Yes, anything. Susanoo smiled. The unpleasant expression from a moment ago was nowhere to be seen. You don't have to do it if you don't have confidence. I don't have confidence. Susanoo nodded. I accept. Susanoo's bet is established. If you win, you can get the answer to one question. The answer must be true. The system rang. A bet with Susanoo, who was recognized as the boss of the dungeon, not a player, was considered part of the test. Anyway, with this, there was no way that the answer that came out of Susanoo's mouth would be false. It's a pity that it's only one. If possible, I wanted to know more about Sambujaja. Snap. Wu Wen took a step back. The distance was too close. It was necessary to fight at a certain distance, as long as he did not know all of Susanoo's abilities. Susanoo did not follow Wu Wen like that. He thought the same. Fortunately, kahahehe, kyahaha, ha 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 ha, tens of thousands of ghosts burst into laughter at the same time. The soul that had become Susanoo's blood and flesh was now gathering at his sword. A guy like you accepted my invitation. Creepy. His body became numb, and he felt a cold chill. The energy he felt was not overwhelming. It would be pitiful to think of him as a high ranker ranked 57th. However, this murderous intent is real. It is the murderous intent of one who has killed thousands of rankers, hundreds of thousands of players, and millions of people. It is a karma engraved on the soul that never disappears, even if it has lost all its strength after death. Only that remained as it was during his lifetime, fully displaying its presence. Creepy, creepy. Tension was tight, and he had the illusion that his skin was peeling off on its own. Wu Wen concentrated on Susanoo's movements. And finally. Scat. Susanoo's sword was drawn. Clang, clang. Kuaa, ah, ah. Every time the swords clashed, the screams of the dead grew louder. Every time the swords collided, the wailing of the dead grew louder. I hope it goes my way. Wu Wen's movements may have vapored leisurely and slow, but the tip of his sword was fast enough to be visible to the eye. Clang, clang. The two swords grazed past one another. Wu Wen sharpened his senses. Then, the sword that has pierced the dead repeatedly swung again. Thwack, 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 thwack. Screech. The sword swung a dozen or more times in a split second. Wu Wen took a step back and blocked the sword. He had the feeling that the power and energy contained in the sword would split his body in two any second now. You're blocking it well. Dring, dring. Sweat immediately formed on Wu Wen's forehead. His concentration was at its highest. In order to barely glimpse the sword that was fast enough to divide a second into 100, he had to focus every nerve in his body on the tip of the sword. Despite being corpsest hath ad long shinsi decayed, Susanoo Sasanoo, huh. His swordsmanship was like that of a ghost. No wonder Odin praised him so. He was certainly a terrible murderer, but it was clear that he was a genius in swordsmanship. Clang. Wu Wen's body floated upwards. Thanks to the use of the giant's strength and sensory territory, he was able to react to the speed, but he was gradually being pushed back by the power. Rumble. His right arm swelled up. The giant's strength has entered your arm. His strength filled him up again, and he swung his sword with all his might. Bang. The sound of the swords colliding was quite loud for a sword and a sword. Thanks to the use of gigantification, he was no longer being pushed back by the power. However, that's no tenna. Swish. Susanoo's hand covered Wu Wen's eyes. The palm filled with the dead's energy. The moment it covered his vision. Whoosh. Wu Wen's head turned to the side. Slash. Susanoo's hand, which had missed, touched Yuan's shoulder. Then, a strong evil force was felt, and a burning sensation spread across his shoulder. Sizzle, 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 sizzle. The dead's energy instantly corroded Yuan's shoulder. He tried to protect his shoulder by drawing up his mana, but it didn't have much effect. There was no way to repel Susanoo's power. Gotcha. Susanoo smirked as he faced Yuan, who had been dodging his sword like an eel. But that was what he had been hoping for. Slash. Instead of dodging or repelling, Yuan grabbed Susanoo's shoulder in the same way. At the same time, rumble, a purple fire spread across Susanoo's shoulder. Susanoo's expression crumpled at the burning sensation. That fire again. Crackle, crackle, crackle. The fire that slowly spread across his shoulder. It was the holy fire, a fire that would never go out as long as Yuan's mana didn't run out. Susanoo, feeling an unpleasant sensation he had never felt before, chose to let go of his hand rather than fight it. Pop! The distance between them increased in an instant. Yuan touched his shoulder. The blackened, corroded shoulder was numb and weak. Certainly, the power that Susanoo wielded was deadly. But so was his. Rumble. Instead of going out, the fire burned even brighter. This is also dangerous. It was a sensation he had never felt before in his life. Susanoo frowned as he tried to put out the fire Yuan had started. For some reason, the fire that had attached itself to his body would not go out. But also, it's not burning anymore. The fire that had attached itself to Susanoo's body did not burn anymore and remained as it was. Is he not afraid of fire? The holy fire was a fire that grew by feeding on its opponent's fear. The holy fire, which instinctively caused aversion and fear and grew in size on its own, was the most powerful skill Yuan possessed. However, Susanoo did not seem to be very afraid of the holy fire. It was because Yuan's skill in handling it, rather than the nature of the holy fire itself, was still lacking. Strength, speed, mana, I'm being pushed back in every spec. The holy fire barely works either. Although it had been a short fight, it was clear that the gap could not be easily narrowed. Yuan looked down at the quillin of his right hand, which held the sword. I wish things would go as planned. Chapter 113. What are you thinking? Susanoo approached. His body was still covered in purple flames, and he moved as if nothing was wrong. We don't have time to fight. Pop! The tip of his sword moved again. He followed the sword with his eyes and sensed its movement with his expanded senses. It was still as fast as a shadow, making it difficult to follow. Furthermore, whoom, the dead gathered at the tip of Susanoo's sword. It burned fiercely like condensed mana. Roar, puck. A clear line appeared where Susanoo's sword had passed. It blurred the boundary between this world and the afterlife, and had the power to instantly swap the living with the dead. Having narrowly avoided the sword just like before, Wu Jin tensed up even more. If I get hit, it won't end with just a little blood. Maybe the wound wouldn't heal and would stay with him forever, causing him pain for the rest of his life. It's not fun if you just keep dodging. Susanoo muttered in disappointment and nodded his head. Indeed, is that all you can do? The tip of his sword moved. A sword that looked like an afterimage. Even though he was using both the heavenly eye and the sensory field, the changes were so drastic that it was difficult to follow properly. It's not for nothing that he's nicknamed the Sword Demon. The sword he saw with his eyes wasn't everything. Thanks to using the heavenly eye, he could see close to its essence, but if it weren't for that, he might have seen several swords. You dodge well, as expected. Swish. Susanoo ran at him with the holy fire wrapped around his body. The flames didn't get any stronger. It meant that Susanoo wasn't afraid of the holy fire. Thud. Susanoo's sword rose. Wu Jin deflected the sword that was stabbing at his chest. Susanoo's one and only eye changed. The corners of his mouth turned up. Crackle. Wu Jin's gauntlet, which he was wearing on his right hand, emitted a black light. Quiney. The item that Susanoo had been waiting for had finally begun to exert its power. Creak. Quiney's back of the hand opened, and a little bit of yellow light leaked out. The speed at which the eye opened was quite slow. If you didn't look closely, you could barely see it opening. Roar. Yes, that's what you should have done. Kya ha ha, ha ha ha. Yeah. The souls of the dead wrapped around Susanoo's body wailed and soared up as if their energy had exploded. In an instant, his size felt several times larger. The space centered around Wu Jin and Susanoo froze coldly, and the air was filled with the breath of the dead. Wu Jin looked at Susanoo. Rank 57, he seemed to be trying to regain his past glory. He felt like an undead who had been dead for over 1,000 years, his power was endless. He was replacing his rotten and weak flesh and power with the souls of the dead. Please, don't die right away. Swish. Susanoo gripped the sword with both hands. A posture of cutting something in half. He raised the sword as if he would split Wu Jin's body in half in one breath. I have a lot to tell you. Wu Jin felt the enormous energy wrapped around Susanoo's sword with his whole body. It was like a huge typhoon was coming towards a small candle. Compared to the endless power of the dead he was emitting, his own power was still very small and shabby. Nevertheless, swish, Wu Jin didn't dodge and aimed his sword. Are you trying to hit a rock with an egg? He wasn't just dodging, he was trying to fight head-on. Susanoo felt anticipation and disappointment at the same time as he looked at the shabby tip of Wu Jin's sword. He thought that maybe Wu Jin would show another hidden power, and at the same time, he thought that he was giving up. Screech. In the frozen time, Wu Jin's thoughts moved. I can see it. He could hear the cries of the dead, and he could see their forms. A clear sight. For quite a long time, Wu Jin had been seeing and feeling them. The Sea God's Stone has the power to control beings that belong to the sea. Wu Jin recalled the time when he had summoned sea monsters through the Sea God's Stone. And the Sky God's Stone has the power to control beings that belong to the sky. Crackle. Quiney emitted a black magic power. Then the Black God's Stone. Wu Jin's will was transmitted through the yellow gap. I heard the voices of the dead, and looked straight at them. That moment, follow, flash, Quiney's eyes opened wide. Summoning, hell, hiya. The bewildered dead wandered around, and finally screamed. Along with them, Susanoo, who had been expanding his size using them as a medium, panicked. What? The dead began to escape his control. They were clearly the dead who had moved according to his will for thousands of years. But now, all of a sudden, they were following the orders of another being. As the power of the dead disappeared, Susanoo's appearance, which had gradually changed into that of a half-human, became closer to that of a skeleton. What the hell is this? You told me. Susanoo said that Yuan was not handling Quiney properly. Since then, Yuan had been constantly studying how to handle Quiney. Of course, you probably thought of it as just another necromancer. Ah, yeah, so it wasn't a matter of conscience, was it? A matter of conscience. Susanoo thought of the item Quiney as an item that could summon the undead. That was why he said that Yuan's reason for not summoning the undead was because of ethical problems, such as not being able to turn dead people into undead. Maybe it wasn't wrong. In fact, Hades commanded countless dead and had an army as large as Susanoo's. If Quiney was used properly, Yuan might be able to summon the undead as well. But, it's thrilling. Quiney's real power lay in its absolute dominance over the dead. Anyway, now that the rock has gotten smaller. Crackle. The magic power emitted from Quiney wrapped around the sword, and Yuan's sword invaded Susanoo's space. Now I can break it. Quiney's dominance took away Susanoo's dominance. Susanoo tried to bring the dead back under his control, but not everything went as he wanted. Swish. The dead were still wrapped around Susanoo's body. The number was half of what it was originally. Still, about half of the dead had escaped Quiney's dominance and were following Susanoo. The tip of the sword, which had been still, moved. The sword, which contained the power of the dead, fell down. Quat, Zok. A purple wave that melted the souls of the dead swept across the ground. Yuan stood head-on, exploding his magic power inside it. It was reckless. Zok. Tens of thousands of dead who followed Susanoo devoured Yuan. The ground where the two stood split into thousands of pieces. The terrain changed with a single slash. Susanoo put his sword diagonally on his shoulder and looked at the place where Yuan had been. You're going to break me? He had shown quite remarkable skills. He had amazing skills that were hard to believe for a 21st floor player. However, Susanoo never thought that he would lose, even so. You're dreaming the impossible. This dungeon was his eternal playground. He would never be defeated and would enjoy fighting even after he died. He had to. But, a dream, that's too grandiose. Crack, snap, the purple wave split and Yuan appeared. Someone like you is just a small detour. Crackle, the yellow eyes flashed. Summoning, hell. A black background emerged under the ground where Yuan stood. Hell, now he seemed to have a vague idea of what it was. He didn't need to think deeply. A world where the dead live. He raised his sword. Quiney is a medium that borrows the power of that world. Ironically, he had unintentionally learned how to handle Quiney. Yuan had fought countless dead as he climbed the tower from the 1st to the 100th floor. And in the process, Queenie had absorbed the grudges of countless souls, and Yuan was able to realize the original function of the item called the Black Soul Stone. Buzz. The sword that held Queenie fell down. Clang. Kya. The dead screamed. Susanoo's power wavered unsteadily. After he swung his sword down a few more times, Susanoo's posture collapsed for the first time. It was time to press the attack. Growl. The giant's power fills your arm. Even more power surged into his arm. His right arm hardened as if it was going to burst. Boom. The skeletal arm shook. Susanoo received Yuan's sword and his eyes turned bloodshot. He also started to get pushed back a little in strength. He tried to raise his killing intent and gather more of the souls of the dead, but it was no use. How could he stand so firm in front of him? It was a killing intent that even the average high ranker feared. He had found it strange when he stood calmly in front of him. But now that he was facing him head-on, all the strange things he had felt before seemed like the tip of the iceberg. To withstand killing intent was not simply a matter of strength and weakness, but something that could not be done without experience and mental strength. What are you really? It was not something he should say to an opponent he was fighting with swords. But he couldn't help but wonder. To that, you won. I'll tell you if I win. He said it in passing and tapped Susanoo's sword again. Clang, boom, the two swords clashed in succession. The odds were gradually tilting in his favor. It was after Quen's eyes had opened. Why on earth? He was the one who burned the souls of the dead as fuel. But from a certain point on, the dead began to escape Susanoo's control. As a result, the balance of power was rapidly collapsing as the fuel ran out. Why do they keep getting out of control? That wasn't the end of it. Crackle, crackle, Quen's eyes flashed fiercely. With the shells of the dead that had been wrapped around his body disappearing, Susanoo met his eyes head-on for the first time. Then, roar, an intense sense of fear that enveloped his whole body stimulated his brain. He couldn't put any strength into the hand holding the sword. His trembling hands seemed to be trembling with fear. What is that? The yellow eyes behind Yuan. Susanoo's body stiffened. That moment, whoosh, aha, the pain felt like he was burning from the inside out. It was a pain he hadn't felt in a long time. Susanoo struggled to put out the fire on his body. It was strange. Clearly, he had died and become an undead. He was a being who could not feel pain. The fire that had not gone out and was still burning came back to life. Yuan looked at Susanoo and smiled. I guess that's scary. Holy fire was a fire that grew by consuming the fear of its opponent. And it was the same even if it wasn't necessarily fear of the holy fire. No matter how great a high ranker you are, you're still a dead man in the end. The dead are influenced by Quen's power. It wasn't just the dead that Susanoo handled that were affected. Susanoo himself was also a being who had died long ago and become undead. As the armor of the dead that had wrapped around his body peeled away, Susanoo too began to be affected by Quen's power. It's a futile ending, though. Thud. Yuan approached Susanoo. This suits you. He was close enough to reach out and touch him. Susanoo, who had been writhing in pain from the fire, opened his eyes wide. How dare. Spot. The tip of the sword aimed precisely at his throat. However, stop. Clang. Susanoo's sword did not reach Yuan. The hand holding the sword trembled. The will to kill and the opposite will were mixed together in Susanoo's mind. The victor was Yuan's order. Clack. Yuan's palm covered Susanoo's face. Susanoo had lost all his strength and had completely become a skeleton. Go in peace. Flash. Quen's pupils flashed once more. Crack. Susanoo's bones cracked and withered as if the moisture had been sucked out of them. You have cleared Susanoo's dungeon. You have obtained Susanoo's soul. You have obtained Susanoo's relic. You have obtained the title, King of the Dead. You can exit the dungeon using the return command. The dungeon will collapse in 30 minutes. Chapter 114. Quen's eyes closed. The back of his hand ached. As expected, there was still quite a lot of pain. It was because he had forcefully used hell. Still, it's quite bearable now. At first, it was a skill that he couldn't use more than a few times before collapsing. But now, he could endure it even if he used a lot of power. It was thanks to his stats increasing enough to support the skill. Are you really dead? Arthur's voice was heard. He had been able to hear Arthur's voice since around the 90th floor. Perhaps it was around that time. He had noticed Quen's ability. You were already dead. To be exact, your soul and body were separated. Is that so? And don't say such things in the future. It's scary to think that a guy who was dead might come back to life. Why, yes. After leaving an important warning for Arthur, Yuan checked the rewards. Soul, relic, and title. The relic was a reward he had already expected. The unexpected rewards were the soul and title. Quinn absorbs souls. It was an unexpected variable. In Arthur's case, the quest had been created by the system, so it made sense. After all, since it was a quest related to Arthur, it wasn't strange for his soul to be attached to him. However, this is the first time I've heard of a soul being a reward. Of course, depending on the player who received the reward, it could be a great reward. If he had skills related to necromancy, he could use Susano as an undead, so it would be something to envy any item in the tower. But right now, Yuan didn't have such skills. Yuan turned his attention to another reward. The relic is over there. The giant chair where Susano had first been sitting. Above it was a box. For the system to create a dungeon, there must be a reward for it. It was a set law of the tower, and Susano had to prepare a reward on the last floor in order to create a dungeon. Yuan walked towards the box. The box was quite large. It was big enough for a person to fit inside. Yuan opened the box, which was covered in rust and dust, turning it black. Creak. A single sword lying flat caught his eye. The sword of Kusanagi. He had known what Susano's relic was for a long time. One of the 3 artifact divine treasures of the 3-eyed, the sword of Kusanagi was a reward that Susano had received after killing the Yamata no Orochi. It was an item that had never truly shined because it had disappeared with Susano's death. However, the sword of Kusanagi would later become an item that represented the 3-eyed. But, it doesn't suit me. The Kusanagi was a demonic sword. It was a sword that made its user strong in the short term, but in the long term, it devoured their power and life. Yuan wasn't weak enough to have to rely on a sword that would devour its master. Swish. Yuan put the sword of Kusanagi in his inventory. Although it could be used in emergencies, the sword of Kusanagi had another use. Finally, Yuan checked the title, King of the Dead. Hash category, title, hash grade, S, hash the one that the dead look up to. One who withstands their weight and becomes king. Hash can use mana to control the souls of the dead. Hash can use mana to infuse the souls of the dead into a body. Hash can use mana to summon the bodies of the dead. If owned. Hash can use grudges to infuse stronger power into the bodies of the dead. Yuan's eyes shook after checking the effects of the title. Wait, this can't be. The name wasn't unfamiliar. And the effect was also a skill related to necromancy. Did Hades' skill come from this place? In Olympus, the high rankers representing them were called by many names. Poseidon, the god of the sea, Hades, the god of death, Zeus, the god of the sky. And Zeus was also called the throne of heaven or the king of Olympus. Among them, the other name that Yuan knew for Hades was this. King of the Dead. Yuan thought that it was just a name that reminded him of Hades. Isn't this the reward for clearing the dungeon? Perhaps it was a reward that was given when you handled the quine to a certain extent. Only then did Yuan look down at the quine. Arthur. And Susano's soul. Then this soul as well. He had been thinking that it would be nice to have a skill related to necromancy when he looked at Susano's soul. But even for Yuan, it was quite difficult to obtain a skill related to necromancy, and a skill that was high enough in rank to handle something like Susano's soul was even rarer. But if it was the power of this title, if this was truly the power that Hades, the king of the dead, handled, perhaps he could really control the Death Knight created from Susano's soul. This is more than I imagined. Susano's relic was so good that it was beyond his imagination. Rumble, rumble, rumble. The dungeon began to shake. It seemed that the dungeon was going to collapse in 30 minutes, and the signs were beginning to show. I need to hurry. He decided to check the effects of the title later. For now, he decided to leave this stuffy dungeon. Return. Crunch. A forest with few people. It was the first floor, and it was the forest closest to the end of the world. A place where no one's feet touched and no one could live. No one came here because it was so far from the city, even when riding a sun carriage. This place is perfect. No one was watching, and no one would get hurt no matter what happened. Perhaps the managers or errand boys wouldn't be interested in this place. King of the Dead. Yuan paid attention to the new title. Although he couldn't use the sword of Kusanagi right away, the title was a different story. This title could become the strongest weapon depending on how it was used. Necromancer. An unexpected harvest. Because of that, he lacked research on related skills. I guess I have no choice but to just try it out. Yuan raised his hand. Quinn. The souls of Arthur and Susano were stored in this item. Wang. As he closed his eyes and concentrated, Quinn trembled finely. I get the creeps. Arthur's voice. Is it because of this guy? Saw. Just as Arthur said, it really felt creepy. A scream that seemed to have absorbed all the grudges in the world. Susano's soul was still resisting Eugene at this very moment. Chu-chu-chu-chut, the soul of the top-ranked high ranker. Susano was not a soul that Eugene could handle right now. Above all, he was a necromancer who had dealt with souls for much longer than Eugene. I won't be able to handle this guy for a while. An undead that you can't handle is just an uncertain ally who you don't know when they will turn around. It's better to make a more certain ally now. How do I do it? He looked up at the cold hand holding Quinn, but he couldn't figure out how to do it right away. Usually, when you get a skill or title like this, you are enlightened on how to use it. The message doesn't appear either. What are you trying to do? Arthur asked. Eugene's forehead frowned slightly as his concentration was broken. I got a necromancer-related title. A title, yes, but I don't know how to use this. Undead are beings made up of soul and flesh. Eugene had a sudden thought at Arthur's voice. Flesh and soul. Of these, Eugene had only one, soul. You can summon the flesh of the dead by consuming mana. When possessed. I had forgotten something so obvious. Come to think of it, there was no one around him who had necromancer-related skills. It was an unfamiliar ability with no information. Do you mean I have to find a body? Yeah, I don't think I need to explain how to breathe a soul into it. Perhaps that will happen somehow with the power of the title. The problem is the body into which the soul will be breathed. Eugene, who had been thinking for a moment, began to walk. It seems like it must be a necromancer senior. Thank you for your help. Don't make a terrible sound. I'm Arthur, King Arthur, unlike those low-quality guys, necromancers. He grumbled, but he seemed proud. Then, Eugene ignored Arthur's words and walked into the forest. I will continue to ask for your help in the future. Arthur answered without knowing what Eugene meant. I will. What the hell is this? A hoarse voice. A rough voice and unnatural movements, a strange mass of bones. The orc's body rose and screamed. The first dead has been summoned. Would you like to name it? A message popped up. It's a success. Arthur has been registered. The first undead summoner that Eugene acquired. I was quite satisfied. The result wasn't perfect, but it was enough for him to see the effect of the title. It's a shame to leave the remains in the dungeon. It couldn't be helped that the dungeon collapsed as Susano disappeared, but it was still regrettable. If Arthur's body from before he died had been here, he would have gained a really strong ally. But this isn't bad either. King Arthur, he was a high ranker, so he would show great ability even with this body. He could gradually improve the body that served as the vessel for his soul. Of course, bring me my body right now. Unlike Yuan, the result was the worst for Arthur. For the proud King Arthur to be in the body of an orc, his pride must have been hurt. I don't have it. What? The dungeon disappeared after you hunted Susano, who was set as the boss. It's not that strange. That can't be. If he had a face, it would probably look like the world was collapsing. Yuan held back his laughter at this situation and said, be satisfied with that body for now. There's no other body to get right now. Thud. Arthur ended up kneeling, something he had never done in his life. If he had tears, he would probably be crying. But Yuan wasn't interested in Arthur's reaction. There was something else that was important right now. Yuan opened the grimoire and said, aren't you going to come out? Wiggle. The light coming out of the grimoire grew stronger. At that moment, the grimoire's influence that was binding Susano's soul weakened. This feels dirty. He had played with the souls of others his entire life. Now that the tables were turned, Susano was feeling a sense of revulsion that he had never felt before. You have to keep your promise, right? The bet with Susano. He could only bind his soul for now, but since the bet had been made, he could hear the answer to the question he wanted. You must be curious. There is one thing I'm curious about. Does it have to do with that guy over there? Arthur was still screaming desperately. Yuan continued to ignore him and nodded. Yes, tell me, who asked you to kill the king? There was only one answer he could hear. Yuan asked this question because he was sure that Susano didn't kill Arthur by accident. But, I'm sorry, but I can't answer that. Why not? I don't know who the bastard is either. Yuan's brow furrowed. This was an unexpected answer. He had confirmed that there was someone behind this, but he couldn't find out who it was. But there is a way to show you. SSSSH. The fog coming out of the grimoire covered Yuan's body. At that moment, chish-cha-chach. This is tens of thousands of undead soldiers. In the middle of them, he could see the view of someone wearing a colorful dragon robe. Through the black fog, Susano's memories unfolded before his eyes. Chapter 115, Susanoo yawned. The story before his eyes was boring and dull. So, this is what you wanted to show me. As an answer to who had asked him for help, it was not bad. If they did not know the person, the most certain way would be to show them the actual situation. So, you want me to kill that bastard named Arthur? Yes, I beg you. Why would I, who's not even a high ranker, do it myself? No, rather than that. Susanoo, who had been sitting with his chin on his hand, looked at someone wearing a robe with his transparent eyes. Who the hell are you to talk to me? Swaa. An enormous murderous intent wrapped around the body of the robed person like thousands of blades. At the same time, Susanoo's army began to stir like waves. Grr, creak, creak, screech. Thousands of death knights, undead without bodies, and even monsters made of bones. This was the grandeur of a one-man army. Susanoo had reached the 57th rank with his own power and the power of this army. An overwhelming presence. It doesn't matter who I am. However, the robed person did not flinch. His opponent was Susanoo. Dying by his hand did not mean simple death. If he were to die by his hand, he would become one of the many undead in this army. What's important is what you want, isn't it? What I want. For the first time, curiosity surfaced in Susanoo's eyes. He had climbed to the top of the tower and became a ranker, and had been granted a life close to eternity by the system. After that, it had been a succession of free and boring days. What did he want? It was an interesting topic. What is it? Don't you want war? War. It was a word that tickled his ears. The robed person continued to speak. Don't you want this tower to be soaked in blood? Susanoo's eyes wavered. He felt a thrill. War. A tower soaked in blood. The days that would change because of it. The swordsmanship would not stop. If only a war broke out, he would no longer have to worry about penalties or the administrator's sanctions. He could just enjoy playing under the sky of the battlefield. That's an interesting story. That was an interesting story. So, did you get what you wanted? Susanoo moaned. Wong. The Hathathad bean covering Robinina's face fell back. Ona's strangely green skin, there was only one eye without pupil. That guy, Yuana's face, who had been looking at them with Susanoo Shaya's, fluttered. Susanoo, on the other hand, stared at them with a confused look. I've never seen you before. Arayuranker. Anik face. No, it was a face that was impossible to recognize. If there was such a person, it would be normal for at least some rumors to be circulating. I am not a member of the tower. Ashamed of his face, he put the hood of his robe back on and continued speaking. You don't care about my identity anyway, do you? That's right, the death of the King of Knights is just a small seed. However, Robin's appearance gradually blurred. Susanoo tried to reach out to him, but he couldn't. Robin's figure disappeared like an illusion. The seeds will be sown everywhere. With those words, Robin disappeared from his spot. Quangok. Strength entered his outstretched hand. Susanoo remembered Robin's figure, which seemed to have been caught in the palm of his hand. Seed, seed, a thrilling feeling, ooh, ha ha ha, ha ha ha. For the first time in a long time, a refreshing laugh came out. King of Knights, Arthur. A high-ranking ranker and the King of Britain, who was quickly rising in the ranks. The owner of the Guild Round Table. Yes, good. Susanoo rose from his seat. He, who had repeatedly fought the undead army he had created and spent his days in boredom, began to move after a long period of inactivity. I'll let you dance to your heart's content. SSSU. The fog that had spread wide disappeared. Isthorld Seenthro Susanoo's memory disappeared, the original scenery unfolded before his eyes again. That's all. Susanoo's words continued. I don't know what that guy is. Thanks to him, I was able to fight that bastard, and it was quite fun. When Yuan turned his head, he saw Arthur sitting on the floor with his head down, looking resigned. How much longer was he going to grieve over just one body? Next time, I'll have to find a more useful body for him. So, did you get what you wanted? Not long after that, the Great War began. Gigantomachi, I had quite a bit of fun. It's a shame Hades interfered or else I would have enjoyed it even more. It seemed that Susanoo had participated in the Gigantomachi and was stopped by Hades. Of course, with Susanoo's personality, there was no way he would have fought on the side of either the Giants or Olympus. And Hades would not have been able to leave Susanoo alone. Anyway, it's a shame you didn't get what you wanted. You must have wanted the three fates to get involved in that guy's death, right? At first, yes, my thoughts became complicated. But the board is bigger than I thought, so now my head hurts. Bigger board? Was he talking about Robin's plan to turn the tower into a bloody war? But strangely, Susanoo felt like Yuan wasn't just grasping at straws. Do you know who that guy is? Yes. Yuan nodded his head. Very well, in fact. Who is he? I've looked everywhere and I can't find him. You won't. He can be anything and do anything. Yuan's voice wavered. He tried his best to seem calm, but it wasn't easy. He had only borrowed someone else's eyes, but he hadn't expected to see him this soon. The foolish chaos, Ashura, Merlin, Vishnu, and all the other comrades he had fought alongside. They had all died in the last battle. They had managed to capture the foolish chaos, but in the end, it had just been a bloody battle. Who is he? The oldest god that has ever entered the tower. Outer god. Yuan thought back to the fight he had with him and answered as if making a pledge. He killed my friend, and I killed his. Yuan shook his head. He is the one that I will kill. Yuan got a room on the first floor. As he laid his head on the bed, all the thoughts he had been suppressing came flooding back to him. He didn't feel like going to meet Hephaestus. He felt strange. The foolish chaos, that was what everyone called him. He was quick, faster than I thought. Everything was. After returning with the help of the clockwork, Yuan experienced many things. Most of them were things he had planned to do with his colleagues. However, everything was going smoother than he had expected, and he felt that everything was going well. Arthur's death was about 1,000 years ago. Arthur was still hiding. He was the only one who had seen his memories through Susanoo. Arthur probably didn't know who had tried to kill him. That guy must have planned to plant a seed in Britain with Arthur's death. It had already been 1,000 years since the seed was planted. Quite a long time. This was enough time for the seed to take root and bear fruit. If that was really the case. The things happening in Britain. Various incidents popped into Yuan's head. The Second Gigantomachy, Ragnarok, the Celestial War, the Heavenly Demon War. All sorts of incidents came to mind, but only a few of them could be linked to Britain. They wouldn't have spent so much time just to change the King of Britain. If it was a seed planted by the foolish Harmonia, who desired chaos in the tower, then they must have had a bigger picture in mind. Is that the only thing? A major incident related to Britain. As he thought about it, he could see a bigger picture. Yuan got out of bed and shook his head. Nothing would change just by thinking about it. I can change the game. Whoosh. Yuan looked at Arthur's soul, which was sleeping in the quinine. Arthur, who was screaming for a new body as soon as possible. He would become Britain's hidden card. I have no choice but to go up for now. Everything was up there. Like everyone else, sleep suddenly came upon Yuan before he knew it. It was the same for Yuan. If there was one difference, it was that Yuan usually knew when he was falling asleep. That was why he often had lucid dreams. Was that a dream? Yuan blinked at the sight in front of him. It was a familiar sight. Hundreds of rancors. A heavy atmosphere hung in the air. The man in front wiped the blood from his neck with the back of his hand. Did the second head get cut off, too? As expected, it was the same words he remembered. The first to speak was an old man with a beard that reached his chest. The Archmage Merlin. He was the guardian deity of Britain, and had fought alongside Yuan a long time ago. It doesn't matter. How can it not matter? My brother is dead. Merlin clicked his tongue. With pity, he looked at the man who had only one head left. Asura, a monster with 3 heads and 6 arms. A top-ranked high ranker, 16th in the rankings. And yet, here he was, looking up at the sky with 2 of his heads cut off. You can avenge him. Will that bring my brothers back to life? It doesn't matter. He's as stubborn as ever. Merlin shook his head at the sharp retort. The atmosphere was heavy. Everyone thought that this was the final battle. Of course, the foolish chaos. I don't know about the others, but we definitely have to catch that one. In Merlin's eyes, he could see a giant purple wave approaching in the distance. Yuan's gaze swept over his surroundings. The power from outside the tower was consuming the tower, and the world was being dyed the color of the outside. There was only one time when this phenomenon occurred. They're coming. They're here. Far away. Beyond the numerous towers, the outer gods were gathering. Asura stepped forward to face them. Was it because of the death of his brothers? Even in the past, he had always been the first to charge into battle, but today he seemed to be taking a few steps further forward. Yuan looked at Asura's back. He will die today, right here, right now. No, everyone except me. Thud. Yuan followed after Asura. Perhaps in this dream, he could change the outcome. Well, look at that. You're taking the lead. Asura was taken aback by Yuan's reaction. Yuan had been participating in more battles lately, but it wasn't often that he took the lead like this. But, yeah, his voice was filled with regret. I should have done this sooner. If he had, maybe a few more of them would have survived. Whoosh, was it because this was a dream? Flames flickered in Yuan's eyes. In his bloodshot vision, he could see the outer gods approaching in the distance. And among them, come on, the foolish chaos was leading the outer gods. I'll kill you over and over again. Chapter 116. Even though it was a dream, it felt like I had fought really hard. It was a recreation of the past. Yuan swung the sword he had made by sharpening Hephaestus's hammer over and over again, until the sword broke and turned to dust. And at some point, Yuan regained consciousness. Whoosh, wind came in through the slightly opened window. When he looked outside the window, dawn was just breaking. It's still dawn. He had woken up earlier than he thought. He didn't need to sleep any longer, but he had just come out of a dungeon, so he had planned to sleep for a day. He didn't feel like sleeping any longer. Clatter. He poured water into a glass and drank it, and his mind cleared up. The dream came to mind clearly. What crap, he had killed a lot, but he had died just as much. The Asura, who had fought at the front, cutting through the purple waves, was eventually eaten by the outer's mouths, leaving only one head. His stomach still churned when he recalled that sight. Clang, he put the cup back down. To calm his queasy stomach, he recited a magical chant in his head. The future can be changed. That was why he had come to the past. Not much had changed yet. The only thing that had changed was himself. The changes to the tower that had come about because of Yuan were still as small as dust. Now, it begins. Get lost, you punk. Swish. Bam, a hammer flew towards him. Since it was flying towards his chest instead of his head, it seemed like he didn't intend to kill him. Yuan didn't avoid the hammer. His chest throbbed in pain. Hephaestus flinched, as if he hadn't expected Yuan to actually get hit. Are you feeling better now? What took you so long to come? I went on a little trip. You didn't even take the test, and you think you can just do whatever you want. He grumbled, but Yuan could hear him. It seemed like he had looked into Yuan's recent actions, since he knew that Yuan hadn't taken the test. I apologize. Tisk, are you okay where I hit you? It hurts a little. Why didn't you dodge it? If I get hit, won't you calm down a little? And if I apologize, you'll feel even better. You punk. Hephaestus scratched his head in annoyance. He didn't throw his hammer unless he was really angry. Yuan had seen him angry a few times, and the quickest way to calm him down was to get hit by one of his hammers. It wasn't like he was throwing it to kill him anyway. He was just throwing it to vent his anger. It hurt a little to get hit, but it was much better than having to endure Hephaestus's anger even more. So, where did you go running around? Tell me your story. I went to a dungeon. Until now, the whole time. Yes, you're not the type to struggle with a single dungeon at your level. I doubt you'd be struggling with just one dungeon at your level. Hephaestus took out his crafting knife and immediately began his delicate work. As it was made with a foundation of adamantium, it wasn't easy to give Quinae a new modification, even if it was just a small groove. It was a bit difficult. Because it wasn't an ordinary dungeon. Hephaestus tilted his head as if he still didn't understand. He was one of the people who knew Yuan's skills the best. He already had the strength to fight a crisis from the first floor, and his item, Quinae, was also an item born from Hephaestus's hands. The 21st floor. It was hard to believe that there was a dungeon below that low of a floor that Yuan had found difficult to clear. It seems you've gone to another strange place. Hephaestus picked up the hammer that had fallen to the floor. He didn't ask any more questions. It was a dungeon that had already been cleared, and dungeons weren't the blacksmith Hephaestus's area of interest in the first place. Did the crafting go well? Yeah, that's a relief. I almost just broke it a few times and endured. Yuan followed Hephaestus to the warehouse. His warehouse was still dazzling. The works of Hephaestus, the best blacksmith in the tower. If even one of them went outside, it would cause a huge commotion. When Hephaestus was short on living expenses or didn't have the money to buy materials, he sold these one by one. Where did I put it? Ah, here it is. Hephaestus rummaged through the items he had piled up for a long time and picked up a wooden box this time. Here, take a look. Yuan received the wooden box and opened it. Inside the wooden box was a jewel that shone brilliantly with a blue light. It felt as if the sea had been compressed into this small jewel. True sea god stone, a piece of water that was born in the beginning of time. It is made of water mana. Classification. Material item. You can rule over all seas. Converts mana to water attribute. Summons the sea, limited. Hash resistance to water attribute mana increases by 50%. Hash amplification rate of water attribute mana increases by 30%. Hash mana consumption of water attribute decreases by 30%. The overall structure of the item wasn't very different from the Dark God Stone. The differences were that the attributes of the item itself were different, and there was the effect, Rule over the Sea. Rule over the Sea. I don't know exactly what this is. It felt different from when he had summoned sea monsters, including the Leviathan, in the 20th floor's test. Unlike living monsters, the sea felt more vast. Rule over the Sea. It seemed like he would have to directly use this effect to confirm what it was. Use it by embedding it into Quine for now. It'll be much better than just using it as is. Is that possible? It's not difficult since you just have to make a small groove. I'll just fix it up for a bit. Give it to me. I'll be done in half a day. Yuan took off Quine and handed it to Hephaestus. Hephaestus immediately took out his crafting knife and began his delicate work. Since it was made with a foundation of adamantium, it wasn't easy to give the Quine a new transformation, even if it was just a small groove. Yuan waited for the work to finish. The night was deep. A groove was carved into the Quine, and Hephaestus embedded the sea god stone into it. It's just for convenience while carrying it around, it's not properly complete. You'll need to create another similar item to use both of them. Swish. Yuan wore the Quine back on his hand. It was only a small groove that was carved in, but it felt strangely different. It also felt like the glove had become a little colder. Yuan looked at the Quine this way and that before asking. Is there a way to strengthen the Quine itself? Strengthen an item? Yes. By adding different materials or using mana or something. Hephaestus thought about it for a moment. Strengthening a completed item. It was a method that didn't exist at this point in time. But Yuan knew. In the future, Hephaestus would not only learn how to create items but also learn how to strengthen items, greatly shaking up the tower. Hephaestus was definitely the person who could do it. As expected, strengthening, Hephaestus muttered the same words as if he had found a clue. Yuan waited for his thoughts to end. If only he could learn the strengthening technique early, it wouldn't be impossible to use both the Black God Stone and the Sea God Stone fragments with one item. You're occasionally useful too. Occasionally. So where else would you be useful? Hephaestus turned around and waved his hands. The money's fine. You paid for the meal today. Hephaestus immediately sat down in the workshop. He probably had a lot to think about. It might just be a passing story to others, but it wouldn't be like that for Hephaestus. He worked for half a day. But Hephaestus didn't seem tired and immediately picked up a hammer, bringing over an item he had made and began hammering it. I should leave him alone. Yuan left Hephaestus's workshop after saying goodbye. He had received the Sea God Stone with this. The 21st floor's test was only a few days away. About 3.5 months. He had been stuck on the 21st floor for quite a long time. I guess it's time to move up again. The sun rose. In Hephaestus's workshop, several swords, spears, and armors were scattered on the floor. They were all items that were too damaged to function properly, either half broken or bent. Strengthening. Hephaestus held the tongs in his hand and was lost in thought. He had experimented a few times, but he failed every time. He had tried various methods, such as infusing mana to increase its strength or overlaying a new item onto the item. It's difficult. He couldn't quite grasp it, but the words Yuan had left behind still echoed in his head. His life had been one of hammering away, continuously creating new items. He still loved and enjoyed the work, but there was no one who wouldn't get tired of doing the same thing every day. Hephaestus was no exception. However, the field of reinforcement was a field that even Hephaestus did not yet know. Reinforcement sorcerers and enchanters might be able to do it, but that's only temporary, and it doesn't permanently change the performance of the equipment. Hephaestus's brow furrowed. Strengthening. His instincts as a blacksmith were speaking. It wasn't absolutely impossible. So he had to find a way. For the first time in a long time, Hephaestus felt himself burning with passion as a blacksmith. Bang, bang, bang. On the stairs leading to the ground floor. Someone knocked on the door of the workshop. Who the hell is making all that racket in the morning? Hephaestus's expression crumpled as his concentration was broken. He glanced nervously at the door and tried to pick up his hammer again to hammer out a perfectly good sword. Just then, the sound of the door continued. Bang, bang, bang. That's son of a bitch. Hephaestus got up from his seat in annoyance. The sound of the door kept breaking his concentration. He picked up his hammer as if he was going to smash it with one blow. However, crash. What the? It wasn't the sound of someone knocking on the door. It was the sound of something breaking. Is it Olympus? This was strange. It hadn't even been a year since the administrator on the first floor had warned him. He thought that he wouldn't be able to move around freely on the first floor for the next few years, or even decades. Even if he somehow managed to control himself, if he got on the administrator's bad side, he would lose much more than he would gain. There's no way father wouldn't have calculated that much. Then is it the guys under him? Creak. His grip on the hammer tightened. He drew his mana and prepared for battle. Thud, thud. Someone was coming down the stairs. The sound of footsteps indicated that there was only one person. In that case, it was worth a try. The sound of footsteps grew closer. Starting with his long legs, the uninvited guest came into view. Hey, mister. A young boyish voice, long arms and legs, and pure white hair. You're going to die if you swing that around. So why don't you put it down? You. The uninvited guest who had broken down the door was someone Hephaestus knew well. A long time ago, the guy who had come to him and asked him to make a long stick. What are you doing here, monkey? Huh, the uninvited guest who had broken down the door widened his eyes. The being who dared to call himself equal to the heavens. The great sage, heaven's equal. He looked at Hephaestus in surprise and asked. Is this your house? Chapter 117. The atmosphere in the forge was hot. The blazing fire in the forge was made by burning special wood. A conversation took place in it. Why are you here? Hephaestus glared at the man in front of him. Zheqian-de-Seong. A top-ranked high-ranker famous in the tower. He was comparable to the three main gods of Olympus. It was unusual for him to show up on the first floor, the lowest floor of the tower. It doesn't seem like your ontology is here, from what I can see. If my ontology came here, the administrator wouldn't just sit still. Hephaestus nodded at Sun Ogong's words. The administrators paid special attention to the high rankers within the top 100 of the rankings. Even if it was the upper floors, let alone the lower floors, especially the first floor which was the lowest, the administrators would have to pay closer attention if they came down. And right now, my ontology has something to do. Is that so? Why that reaction? Aren't you curious about what it is? I am curious. You're probably messing around with those guys from the heavens again. Well, it's similar. Sun Ogong's situation was famous. The giant guild, the heavens. Sun Ogong was the one fighting a war alone against them. The title, Zheqian-de-Seong, originated from that. Are you using the weapon I made for you well? No, I threw it away. Threw it away? I got something better. Who made it? I don't know. The Dragon King had it, but it wasn't originally a weapon. Not a weapon? Then, I don't know. I didn't ask. Using something that wasn't a weapon as a weapon. Hephaestus thought that was strange as well. Looking closely, there was a thin and long staff hanging on Sun Ogong's back. Is that it? It didn't look very powerful from the outside. It was as thin as a finger, and its length was a little over 1 meter. No matter how great an item it was, its basic length and thickness were lacking. I wonder who made it. But why are you here? He wasn't close to Sun Ogong, but they weren't on bad terms either. If it were a different person, he would have suspected that they might have been sent by Olympus, but Sun Ogong was different. The Sun Ogong that the world knew, and the one that Hephaestus knew, wasn't someone who was under someone else. I'm looking for someone. Kim Yu-won. Do you know him? Hephaestus's expression wavered slightly at the familiar name. And Sun Ogong didn't miss that subtle change. You know him. I don't. Seek. Sun Ogong's lips curled up. His two black eyes changed into different colors. Fiery golden eyes. You can't lie to me. One eye burned red, and the other sparkled gold. Hephaestus looked into Sun Ogong's two eyes and asked. Are those the famous fiery golden eyes? They're just a clone, so the effect isn't as good as the ontologies. The eyes that see through lies and truth. A hollow laugh leaked out of Hephaestus's mouth. How could he escape from those eyes? At least, he didn't have the ability to do so. Even if he was just a clone, he was Sun Ogong. I won't be able to lie like this. However, I don't know. Hephaestus's answer didn't change. You don't know? Yes, you do, mister. I said I don't. How many times do I have to say it? Sun Ogong scratched his head. He scratched it so hard that his hair fell out. Hephaestus looked straight into Sun Ogong's eyes without avoiding them. Mister, I don't want to do this, but if you don't tell me, you might die. Waruk. The fiery golden eyes glared at Hephaestus. The eyes that saw through all things. It was said that those eyes saw through truth, the future, and the past. No matter how much of an avatar he is, Sun Wukong will definitely know that he's lying. Then, should I say that I don't know even if I do? Hephaestus crossed his arms and opened his chest as if to say, poke me if you dare. I don't know. When you pass the 20th floor, you finally become a real player. It was a fairly well-known story on the tower. Players below the 20th floor cannot be called players, and it is said that the real mystery of the tower is experienced after passing the 20th floor. In reality, the gap between players who have passed the 20th floor and those who haven't is considerable. Most of the players who have passed the 20th floor, which can be called the second hurdle, have skills that can be counted on one hand. However, just as there are high rankers above the rankers who have reached the end of the tower, there are bound to be famous players among the players in the lower floors as well. And the best among them is definitely is Kim Yu-won not appearing in this exam either. It was Kim Yu-won. He had made his name known to quite a few players even though he hadn't been in the tower for a year. The winner of the Muram competition. A super rookie who has updated the rankings of all floors. He was climbing the tower at a rapid pace, but at some point, he stopped and didn't take the exam anymore. I guess so. He's been stopped for over 3 months now. Did you decide to settle down here? If I were him, I would have challenged the ranker. Yes, once you become a ranker, you can do anything, not to mention eating and living. If you've come up with that level of performance, you must have accumulated a lot of points, right? I understand that you want to live comfortably. The players gathered in the examination hall talked about Kim Yu-won. 3 months. It wasn't that long. It's common for players to stay on one floor for several years or not be able to move on to the next floor. However, if it's a player like Kim Yu-won, the story is different. I heard that he died. Really, I heard he wasn't on good terms with Olympus. Isn't that a rumor? I heard he was friends with Helgen. Really, when various hypotheses were being put forward. Okay, let's all focus on our exam. If we fail this time, we won't have any points to challenge the exam again. Yes, yes. When the team leader said a word, the team members stopped talking and started to concentrate. Kim Yu-won, Kim Yu-won. The team leader, Reinhardt, an elf player leading a team of 5, looked around. An underground cave with a space of about 100 meters. There was a luminous stone on the ceiling that emitted light on its own. Thanks to this, it was not difficult to secure a field of vision. If possible, I wish that guy wasn't here. It's better not to have a competitor if possible. Needless to say, it was even more so for a competitor with the same level of skill as Kim Yu-won. However, the constant feeling of unease was always right. Where are you talking about me? A chilling voice. Get lost. Reinhardt turned his head. There was a player glaring at them with his arms crossed. My story? What the heck? However, his eyes soon caught the clothes he was wearing. Red robe. It was definitely the clothes of a pyro warlock. What the hell? Kim Yu-won, what, really? The surprised players stepped back from the man. The corners of the man's mouth went up. You're scared. Really, are you Kim Yu-won? At Reinhardt's question, the man's eyes narrowed. What do you mean? Swaa. A gruesome mana gushed out of Kim Yu-won's body. Reinhardt averted his eyes from the murderous intent that seemed to strangle his neck and prick his skin. Oh, no, he's not an ordinary player. I don't know how much his magic stat is, but just by pouring out his mana, I was suffocating. Besides, the Pyro Warlock's clothes are an advanced item worth 50,000 points. The clothes of the fire technique are a high-level item worth 50,000 points. The top players were surprised to hear that Kim Yu-won was not participating in the test above the 20th floor. However, they were even more surprised to see that Kim Yu-won suddenly appeared wearing the fire technique clothes he had used in the martial arts competition. Reinhardt realized that Kim Yu-won was not an ordinary player. The 21st floor test begins, and the players are tasked with protecting the crystal and finding the doppelganger. Kim Yu-won finds the doppelganger and cuts it down in one breath. The players looked at his skills with a mixture of admiration, respect, jealousy, and fear. However, one player looked at Kim Yu-won with an interesting gaze. It was quite an expensive item for an average player to use. Moreover, the clothes of the fire technique were the item that Kim Yu-won had used in the martial arts competition, and they were like his symbol. That's for sure. Gulping, Reinhardt squeezed in between the other players and glanced at Kim Yu-won from time to time. Kim Yu-won has started climbing the tower again. It was the moment a tiger appeared among a flock of sheep. The players who had been waiting quietly closed their mouths. It was because of the appearance of the tiger, Kim Yu-won. If they caught his eye and offended him, they might lose their necks even before the test began. Time passed like that. The 21st floor test will begin. A crystal will be created. Protect the crystal from the monsters that will pour in. There is a doppelganger within the team. The number of doppelgangers is unknown, and the test will fail if the number of players becomes 0 or the crystal is destroyed. Doppelgangers can destroy the crystal. Find and eliminate the doppelgangers. The test will end as soon as all the doppelgangers have been dealt with. In the middle of the cave, keying, a blue crystal about a meter in size appeared, emitting a bright light. This was the device that was the key to this test. It was a crystal doppelganger. Reinhardt looked around at the players around him, tilting his head. The reactions of the other players were no different. Before they knew it, they were watching each other with caution. Was there already a doppelganger mixed in here? If so, it would be impossible to tell who was a doppelganger and who was a real player. Doppelgangers imitate the appearance of a person and even absorb their memories. It was impossible to find them by sight alone. This is quite complicated. That's why you can't tell who the doppelganger is. There were about 100 players gathered there. None of them took the lead. There was a long silence. Then, "You idiots, cringe," a voice that was small but pierced through the crowd drew their attention. A player wearing a red robe and the clothes of the fire technique. Kim Yoo-won opened his mouth. "Are you going to do nothing, scared of such a test? Are you going to keep your mouths shut like mutes? What, shish, hold it in." Some of the players flinched at Kim Yoo-won's rebuke, but they could not come forward and shut their mouths. Kim Yoo-won clicked his tongue at them and continued. "Anyway, I can't do this test alone. Please don't hold me back." And the doppelganger. Kim Yoo-won's head turned to the side. That moment. Squeak. The sword that was drawn in an instant emitted a ray of light and cut the neck of the man next to him. Creak. Thud. The severed head fell to the floor like a liquid, becoming viscous and flowing away. The players around him were startled and exclaimed. Gasp. Monster. Doppelganger. A monster that has no form of its own and lives by taking the lives of other beings. Kim Yoo-won had found and cut down one such doppelganger in an instant. "I'll find the doppelgangers while the test is going on." With those words, Kim Yoo-won put his sword away again. He couldn't find any other doppelgangers right now, and no monsters had appeared. Wow, he's amazing, really. Their gazes were filled with admiration, respect, jealousy, and fear. They were a complex mixture of emotions. Kim Yoo-won's skill in finding and cutting down the doppelganger in one breath was not as different as they had heard. However, among them, one person. This is fun. There was someone looking at Kim Yoo-won with an interesting gaze. This test. Chapter 118. Since catching the first doppelganger, he had been standing guard next to Sujing. Clang, clang, clang. The wall of the cave opened. "They're coming. Everyone, get ready. Take your positions. Anyone who can buff, do it now. Me, tanks, come forward. I'll support you. Don't use banmal, newbie." The exam had begun in earnest. Monsters poured out of one of the open walls. There were well over 100 of them, but the number of players taking the exam was also in the hundreds. What? This is easy. I know, right? I thought there'd be more powerful monsters. The problem is the doppelgangers. Don't let your guard down. We have Kim Yoo-won here, so what's the problem? Kim Yoo-won's presence made the atmosphere in the exam room feel like a festival. The players who had been worried about failing the exam again this time were able to take the exam at ease. Sujing would never be destroyed. Kim Yoo-won would be protecting her. There was no need to look for the doppelgangers. He would find them soon. And so, after the first wave of monsters had finished attacking, a short while later. Clang, clang, clang. Doors opened from two directions. Two this time. Does that mean there'll be two waves? Damn it, it was too easy for some reason. Block them, block them. Even though the number had doubled, it wasn't a big problem. The combined strength of the players, who were divided into various positions such as tanks, healers, and ranged attackers, was strong. They were able to effortlessly block the attacks of the monsters, who were mindlessly charging forward in large numbers. Reinhardt also felt good about this exam. This is a scam. Isn't it strange? Reinhardt, who had stepped back for a moment to rest, turned his head at the sound of a voice next to him. Reinhardt's eyes widened in surprise. Kim Yoo-won. No, it was a mistake. He certainly resembled Kim Yoo-won, but his clothes were different. Unlike Kim Yoo-won, who was wearing pyromancy clothes, the man was wearing completely new gray clothes. He looked so much like him. He looked back and forth between Kim Yoo-won, who was far away, and the man in front of him. They definitely looked alike. The only difference was that his hair was a little longer. I almost made a mistake. Reinhardt brushed his chest and asked. What are you talking about? That Kim Yoo-won. After finding the first doppelganger, He hasn't found another one yet. It's probably taking him some time. It doesn't seem that strange. Doppelgangers were monsters that perfectly mimicked humans. They didn't just mimic their appearance and voice, but also absorbed their habits and all of their memories. It was no wonder that they were difficult to find. Rather, it was a great feat to have already found one. Is that so? The man looked at Leonard's answer with a doubtful expression. Is it really a coincidence? What? Leonard looked at the man as if to ask what he meant. With nothing more to say, the man turned around and walked towards Sujing. He seemed to be aiming to protect Sujing. What a strange guy. Leonard watched him for a moment, then quickly lost interest. There were always people who were suspicious. He didn't think it was a bad thing. When taking an exam, the more suspicious you are, the better. And so, the exam continued without any major incidents. 25 hours 2 minutes and 12 seconds. It had been over a day since the exam had started. Why haven't you found another one yet? Who is the doppelganger? The difficulty of the exam gradually increased. As time went on, monsters began to pour out from a total of 5 different directions. They had no time to spare. They were getting tired, and their wounds were increasing. It was time to find the doppelganger. Damn it, he said he'd find it on his own. Shish, let's listen. Kim Yuan hadn't moved an inch since the exam had started. Since the test had started, Kim Yuan had not moved an inch. But except for those who know each other, it must be in here, right? Isn't that right? After catching the first doppelganger, he had been guarding Soo-hyuk's side the whole time. Thanks to him, no one was able to approach Soo-hyuk past a certain point. This was because Kim Yu-won would step up and block them whenever they tried to approach Soo-hyuk within a few meters. This situation was becoming increasingly difficult and frustrating. That was when it happened. This isn't going to work. Kim Yu-won, who had been silent until now, opened his mouth. Everyone gather around. I have something to say. Something to say. Did you finally find it? Thinking that he might have found another doppelganger, the players gathered around Soo-hyuk. They wanted to hurry up and catch the doppelganger and end the test before the next wave of monsters appeared. Did you find it? Reinhar, who was impatient, asked. His party members were just as impatient and looked at Kim Yu-won with anxious eyes. He shook his head. No, why? It seems like they've all been hiding ever since I caught the first one. They don't even try to aim for Soo-hyuk, and there's no strange feeling. They're probably trying to slowly kill us by wasting our time. This can't be, but we can't keep wasting time like this. Kim Yu-won turned his head and looked at the wall of one of the caves. The 6th door might open next. Quote. The expressions on people's faces turned serious. Even Kim Yu-won, who had believed that there was no way out, was the same. Then why did you suddenly gather us? Kim Yu-won smiled. Let's have a vote. A vote, let's each say one person we suspect might be a doppelganger. With those words, Kim Yu-won drew his sword. If we kill them one by one, the test will end eventually. It wasn't a conviction, but he intended to kill anyone he suspected. The players gathered there felt a chill at his words. If they were wrongly suspected, they might end up being publicly executed even if they weren't a doppelganger. It's not me. We're a team that's been together since the 10th floor. That's right, it's not us. We can vouch for each other. The first to come forward and claim their innocence were the players who had a team. It was only natural, since a doppelganger wouldn't say that they were a doppelganger, there was no point in defending themselves. In the end, they needed someone else who knew them to defend them. Reinhar also shouted urgently, we're the same, all 5 of us here, including me, have been climbing the tower together for a long time. Really, if that's the case, Kim Yu-won listened to people's words and made judgments like a judge. Of the players gathered there, slightly more than half had a team. After thinking for a while, Kim Yu-won pointed his chin in one direction. Then everyone with a team, go over there. At his instruction, the hesitant players split in 2. Players with teams and players without teams. 2 groups were formed. Now, since we don't have much time. The tip of the sword, which had been circling around, pointed at one person. I guess we'll have to kill them one by one, starting now. What are you talking about? Kill us. Voices of protest erupted. In an instant, the test site turned into chaos. Some were already reaching for their weapons. It wasn't just the people who had been targeted who were surprised. What do you mean? Are you saying that all of these people are doppelgangers? They were naive people. They knew that wasn't what he meant, but they thought that it shouldn't be that way. A brief moment of resistance. Kim Yu-won lowered his sword for a moment and answered. Of course not. How could there be so many doppelgangers? Kim Yoo-won sat down on Soo-hyuk's lap and laughed. But if we exclude those who know each other, it's definitely in here, right? So, are you saying you're going to kill someone without being sure? Just based on suspicion? Kim Yoo-won's smile disappeared at the player's rudeness. What then? His gaze turned cold. Should we all just die together like this? What? I'm not bad, right? I won't die anyway. His tone was full of confidence in his abilities. It meant that he would be absolutely safe no matter how many monsters poured out. In the end, it means that you guys are the ones who will suffer. That's not it. Well, everyone hates dying. Kim Yoo-won turned his head. What do you guys think? Do you think you'll all die together like this? It was the devil's whisper. Are there any? That's. Cough. That's no, but, it was a difficult question to answer. At least it's better for someone else to die than for me to die. Kim Yoo-won's words were digging into that point exactly. A long silence. The corners of Kim Yoo-won's mouth went up again. Well, whatever, I guess you all agree. The tip of the sword rose again. The targeted man looked at the tip of the sword that Kim Yoo-won was aiming at. Let's get started now. The tip of the sword began to move. Exactly towards the heart. He intended to kill the first player with a single blow to see if he was a doppelganger or not. But, clang, quote. The sword stopped. A look of bewilderment spread over Kim Yoo-won's face. He blocked his own sword. Even a decent player wouldn't have been able to react in time. But he reacted. If that was all, he wouldn't have been so surprised. Hold on, he was clearly barehanded. Judging by the black gloves he was wearing, it seemed like he was wearing some kind of item, but it still didn't make sense. It wasn't a gauntlet, but a thin glove. Kim Yoo-won glared at the man in front of him. He opened his mouth with a meaningful expression. You're going all the way. What? Whoosh. The man's eyes turned red. Kim Yoo-won, who met his gaze, realized that something was wrong. What kind of skill is this? Strangely enough, he felt like his whole body was exposed when he met the man's eyes. The man looked around at the players gathered around the correction, including Kim Yoo-won. There's a doppelganger in here. The corners of the man's mouth went up. I can't tell if this is smart or stupid. What? I can understand and ignore the fact that you keep joking around. But I can't just let you ruin the test like this. What the hell have you been talking about? It was an unpleasant sound. A blue mana wrapped around Kim Yoo-won's body. His grip tightened and the tip of the sword became sharper. But the result was no different. It won't budge. It didn't matter how much strength he used. It didn't seem like he was gripping it that tightly, but Kim Yoo-won's sword didn't budge, as if it was stuck in a solid rock. If someone were watching from the side, they wouldn't even notice that he was putting strength into the sword. But don't the two of them look alike? Oh my. Now that you mention it. People muttered as they looked at the two of them. Other than the difference in their clothes and hair length, the two of them looked quite similar. They looked like brothers or even twins. It was then. Kim Yoo-won, who had been staring at the man's face, uttered a voice that he hoped he wouldn't hear. Kim Yoo-won. It was the moment when two Kim Yoo-wons appeared in the test room. Chapter 119. Participating in the test, Yoo-won was able to witness an interesting sight. Self-proclaimed Kim Yoo-won. There were always people who impersonated famous people. That was the case now. Perhaps this was an impersonator who appeared because Yoo-won hadn't challenged the test in a long time. They look fairly similar. Their face, which they had likely changed with a skill, was almost perfectly similar to his own. Their hairstyle wasn't exactly the same, so their hair was a bit different. But not many people would suspect him for that. Plus, the guy was wearing the clothes of flame that he had been wearing not too long ago. It doesn't matter. Whether or not there was an impersonator, Yoo-won didn't care much about it. If the guy climbed the tower and did something bad, that would be troublesome, but it wasn't necessarily a bad thing. As the guy climbed the tower like that, Olympus's attention would eventually gather on him. In the end, before the impersonator could be revealed as a fake, Yoo-won would be able to quietly climb the tower. But then, he found a doppelganger in one go. The guy he had thought of as a normal impersonator became a bit more interesting. How did he do that? Doppelgangers were never easy to find. In order to find a demonic monster like that, you either had to be lucky enough to have a player on your team who handled light attribute mana, or you had no choice but to suspect and fight each other until you found all the doppelgangers. He decided to watch for a while. This test was better the faster it was, anyway. But then, he's better than I thought. The impersonator he had been watching for a day was quite skilled. Their acting was artistic, and their voice was confident without a single tremble. It was exactly the image of Kim Yu-won, that people thought of. When he saw him catch the doppelganger, he seemed to be quite skilled as well. Well, that was probably why he was able to plan and execute something like this. The guy was definitely acting as Kim Yu-won, and taking advantage of the benefits that came with it. Perhaps once this test was over, the large guilds would start to move again to recruit Kim Yu-won. It felt like he was watching a child's prank. But even pranks were only understandable when they didn't cross the line. What is this? Not even a real body. He had thought the guy was smart, but that wasn't the case. Yu-won grabbed the tip of the sword pointed at him. Kim Yu-won, please, no, the impersonator's eyes and voice cried out. But unfortunately, things had come too far. I'll deal with you later. Whoosh, the eye of truth glowed. That moment, the eye of truth reveals the truth. Crack, crash, the face of the man impersonating Yu-won began to split apart bit by bit. Ah, ah, ah. The man covered his face with both hands due to the pain he felt in his face. His skin, or rather the thin leather that covered it, cracked and fell to the ground. Tuck, thud, thud. The man with the exposed face lowered his head to the floor, covering his face with both hands. It was an absurd situation. The surrounding players were all stunned. What the hell was going on? Then was that a fake? Kim Yu-won doesn't exist. No, isn't that the real Kim Yu-won over there? Ah, right. While they were trying to figure out the situation, the man lying on the floor raised his head. This bastard is fake. A face that was split open. Inside it was a young child with a pale face. Sharply honed mana circled around him. The mana, which had started to rampage, was certainly superior to that of any of the surrounding players. I'm real, I'm real. Yeah, flash. Stars spread out before the man's eyes. Bam, Yu-won's foot kicked the man in the face. The man's staggering eyes rolled back and turned white, and he fell down powerlessly. Thud, you do it, that name, quote. There was a moment of silence. It was only one hit. Just like the man who had been kicked in the foot, the other players gathered around didn't know what had happened. They only belatedly realized that Yu-won had approached and kicked him in the head with his foot. This side is roughly sorted out. Yu-won soon turned his attention away from the man who had collapsed on the floor. There had only been a brief commotion. The test wasn't over yet. Were you looking for the doppelganger? Yu-won's gaze turned to the players that the fake Kim Yu-won had just tried to kill. They flinched at Yu-won's gaze. The hope that they could live in the sense of crisis that they would really die if they continued like this came to mind at the same time. I'm really not. Really, me neither. A doppelganger, I don't even know what that is. I'll prove it. What do I do? My name is Mile, and my hometown is. Numerous voices were heard. They were all words claiming their innocence. Yu-won walked while listening to them. As Yu-won approached, the people's voices gradually stopped. Were they going to die like this? But their worries soon turned in a different direction. Where are you going? Yu-won passed through the crowd of people and headed towards the other players who had been split in half. Players who knew each other and were in teams. Yu-won approached Reinhardt among them. I see you again. Ah, yes. Reinhardt nodded his head in greeting. He remembered Yu-won. He had thought that he looked somewhat like Kim Yu-won, but he didn't know that he was the real Kim Yu-won because his clothes were different. Were you the real Kim Yu-won? Whoever I am, it's not important to the test. Yu-won turned his head and looked around at Reinhardt and his teammates. Glowing red eyes. When Reinhardt met those eyes, he felt a strange sense of discomfort. It felt as if his whole body was being stripped bare and everything about him was being exposed. Why are you looking at me like that? Who are you? Yes. For a moment, Reinhardt wondered what kind of question that was. However, he soon realized what Yu-won was asking and smiled. Are you doubting me? A doppelganger? He looked around at his other teammates. This is embarrassing. Who am I, guys? You're our team leader. We guarantee it. He's not our team leader. We're sure because he hasn't fallen behind us even once since the test started. That's right. The teammates, guarantee. There was no more certain proof than this. All the players here had gathered with the single purpose of passing the test. Of course, there was no reason for them to defend a doppelganger by saying that they knew someone they didn't. However, just because he has a team doesn't mean he can't be a doppelganger. Yu-won reached out to Reinhardt. Is that really true? Whoosh. Reinhardt was startled and took a step back. What are you doing? Reinhardt was shocked as he stepped back. He was sure he had dodged it, but Yu-won's hand was right in front of his nose. Snap. Yu-won's hand grabbed him by the neck. His breath was cut off. He thought he was really going to die. I can't die like this. At that moment, pop. Something snapped in Reinhardt's head. It was his reason as a human, and at the same time, an explosive force erupted from his body. Reinhardt's eyes flashed and his fist shot out. Thwack. Bang. Reinhardt's fist struck Yuan's side. The mana wrapped around his fist struck the air, making a sound like a bomb exploding. Yuan let go of his hand. Reinhardt's offensive began. Bang. Clank. His fists rained down. The flow of mana was unusual. The other teammates nearby were bewildered. What? Team leader? Was our team leader this strong? The teammates were just as bewildered as he was, knowing him well. Was he hiding his strength until now? If so, why? There was only one possibility. Could he really be a doppelganger? His eyes turned white. The flow of mana was unusual. His skin gradually turned white. Isn't this strange? Yuan dodged his fist and looked back at his teammates. You said you've been together since before the test started. That's true, but, then, have you been a doppelganger since then? It was strange. Their team leader had definitely been with them since before the test started. There had been no situation where he could have been replaced by a doppelganger. Then, I'm hearing this for the first time, too. Whoosh. Yuan's sword pierced through Reinhardt's teammates. Doppelgangers who imitate players, do they even deceive themselves? Poof. Ack. Talia. A scream erupted from the surroundings as the sword pierced through the teammate's head. But soon, an unbelievable sight appeared before their eyes. Kya. Jurururuk. A scream of agony from the pierced sword. And skin and pure white blood flowing down like water. Talia. Another one of their teammates collapsed to the floor, turning into the corpse of a doppelganger. Are you going to show yourself now? Yuan shook the transparent blood of the doppelganger off his sword onto the floor. Doppelgangers. That was the moment. Kuriak. Kyaruruk. Kya. Reinhard and his teammates began to make strange noises and shed transparent water from their faces. Doppelgangers. Monsters that devour the lives of others and possess their thoughts, emotions, and shells. No, devils. The 21st floor trial was the trial where the existence called devil first revealed itself. That's why the mortality rate is so high. Waruk. Wan understands the essence. Yuan's eyes could see it. The true form of the doppelgangers that had devoured someone and taken their entire life. They had turned into humans and had even forgotten that they were doppelgangers themselves when they entered this trial. Even if they were of the devil race, they were just a few low-level doppelgangers. The reason this trial had become so long was because of the fake over there. I'll find out the details later. Yuan appeared among the doppelgangers. Let's end this trial now. Creek. Cheon Salsung's completion rate has increased by 0.001%. Cheon Salsung's completion rate has increased by 0.001%. Cheon Salsung's completion rate. Messages rang out one after another. These were messages that had not appeared when he climbed Susano's dungeon. He had thought that the completion rate had stopped increasing altogether since it hadn't gone up at all, but now he could be sure. He couldn't complete Cheon Salsung by killing undead who were already dead. Oh, over there. The crystal. The crystal located in the middle of the test site. Several players could be seen running fiercely towards it. Doppelgangers with their eyes rolled back, shedding the magical energy that was the symbol of the devil. The doppelgangers weren't just Reinhard and his teammates. Kyahahaha. Taking advantage of the chaos, one of the doppelgangers aimed for the crystal and reached out its hand. The moment the crystal was destroyed, there would be no more point in searching for the doppelgangers. That would be the failure of the trial. But, swish. The hand of the doppelganger that was reaching for the crystal was caught by something. An uncertain form shimmering with purple flames. Cheon Malyang. Warururuk. Pukek. The Cheon Maling of Yuan, who was guarding Su'a, mercilessly blew up the bodies of the doppelgangers. Chapter 120. His consciousness was hazy. Amidst the darkness before his eyes, a faint message could be heard. You have passed the 21st floor test. You can move to the next floor. Level. The faint message felt like a hallucination. Thud. A sensation on his cheek. His eyes opened on their own. The first thing he saw was the black ceiling of the cave. It was the same place as the 21st floor test stage. The test. What happened? The man opened his blurry eyes and rolled his eyeballs. It didn't take long for his mind to clear up. Are you awake? Gasp. Yuan's face appeared right next to him. The real thing was right before his eyes. Just now, he had impersonated him to take the test, so he couldn't help but be surprised. Kim Yu, the name he couldn't bring himself to say. Name. At that moment, Yuan asked for his name. Yes, yes, what's your name? Marvos. Whoosh. Marvos flinched as he met Yuan's eyes that were blazing like flames. Just like before, when he made eye contact with those eyes, he felt like everything was being seen through. It seems you're not a doppelganger since you've finished the test. Yuan frowned. But then again, you're not a doppelganger either. What are you? I'm a doppelganger. Right, yes, I'm also a player. An existence that was both a doppelganger and a player. Yuan was finally able to be convinced by that answer. So you're a pure-blood demon. Yes, a demon player. Something felt strange. It was clear that he had seen this guy's identity as a doppelganger through Yuan, but he felt different from other doppelgangers. He was much harder to detect and seemed to be more intelligent. Above all, the fact that a doppelganger transformed into a player who was participating in the test was something that Yuan had never seen before. Which bloodline are you from? You don't seem like an ordinary doppelganger. His disguise was quite perfect. Not only his appearance, including his voice, but he also had an excellent transformation ability that could not be easily detected by Yuan. This wasn't an ability that a player on the 21st floor would have. My father is that person. That person, Belial, the king of doppelgangers. Belial, it was a familiar name. No, it was impossible not to know. High-ranker Belial, the king of doppelgangers and the monarch of falsehood. One of the 7 monarchs of the great Demon King Guild. There was a greater demon than he thought above him. In terms of guild power, the Demon King was comparable to Olympus. If he was of Belial's bloodline, he was no different from Hargan. Of course, unlike Olympus, there were multiple monarchs in the Demon King. Why is someone like that here? It's a bit complicated to explain. As if it was difficult to answer, Marvos scratched his head. White and pale skin with a young face. He looked just like a teenager in his mid-teens. The cruelty he had shown just moments ago, trying to execute the players one by one, was nowhere to be seen. It's not a lie. If this was a lie, there was no way to explain the doppelganger ability Marvos possessed in his skills. I know this isn't the right time to say this, but... Marvos hesitated for a moment before looking at Yuan and saying, I'm a fan. Really? A fan? Yes. I've been in love with you since before the Muram competition, looking at the rankings. After seeing you fight in the Muram competition, I became a complete fan. Quote. Marvos' eyes sparkled. It was an unexpected story. However, it didn't seem like a lie. Yuan is discerning the truth. Yuan was still maintaining Yuan was still maintaining his composure. If it was a beach club, there were a few places that Yuan remembered. It was a famous place on the 22nd floor that was famous for its coffee. Yuan's composure allowed him to discern some truth even when the other party was determined to lie. But this was so obvious. He wondered if imitating him wasn't just to gain an advantage in the test. Certainly, Marmuz had the ability to pass the 21st floor test without imitating him. Since he was born with the bloodline of a Lord-grade devil, he was comparable to the players of the upper floors. I'm not saying that you should look at me just because I'm a fan. I know I did something wrong. Marmuz scratched his head and bowed his head with an awkward smile. I'm sorry. I'll never do it again. I'll reflect on it. Yuan narrowed his eyes and asked in a deliberately scary tone. Don't you think I'm going to kill you for this? If that was the case, you wouldn't have waited for me to wake up. Yuan smiled faintly. He had a little sense and thoughtfulness. He may be young, but blood will tell. He didn't know why the bloodline of the Demon King was roaming around here, but it was worth the wait. You owe me your life. Marmuz looked at Yuan, who was getting up from his seat, with a puzzled expression. He thought that he would have waited because he wanted something, even though he had saved his life. That was when it happened. Give me your number. Yes. What did he mean by a number all of a sudden? Yuan handed Marmuz his player kit with a startled expression. I'll spare you, so do one thing for me. A month had passed since he received the player kit number from Marmuz. Rumors began to spread that Kim Yuan had started climbing the tower again. Yuan opened his eyes after waking up from a deep sleep. Wang, the player kit vibrated. I've also applied for the next test. Loyalty. A text from Marmuz. The last 2 letters, loyalty, felt very awkward. He said he was a fan. He wondered if it wasn't just something he said to survive. What an annoying personality. Yuan yawned and drank a glass of water before turning the player kit screen to the side. Tick, tick, the remaining test schedules were searched. The 22nd floor, 23rd floor, and 24th floor. There were only 3 tests left to climb to the 25th floor. If I don't fail, I can finish all the tests in the next 10 days. Of course, Yuan wasn't thinking about failing the test. It was just a test on the 20th floor. The test itself wasn't that difficult unless a ranker like Theseus came out and interfered. The test schedule wasn't bad. Olympus wasn't stupid, and they would have to watch out for the administrator's attention. Plus, by now, Zeus and Poseidon's fight would have started in earnest. There's one more thing. Yuan found one more text message on his player kit. It was a name he hadn't seen in a long time. Hargan. He had often contacted him before the martial arts tournament, but it had been a long time since he had sent a text message. I'm on the 22nd floor right now. Let's meet up. Quote. It was an unexpected contact. Hargan had increased his speed in climbing the tower. Unlike Yuan, who concentrated on the test and his grades while taking each floor one step at a time, Hargan's goal was to become a ranker as quickly as possible. He must have come down quite a bit if he was on the 22nd floor. What's going on? Anyway, there were still a few days left until the test. There was nothing to do until he arrived in Britain. Yuan replied to Hargan's text message. You're buying the coffee. Come to the beach club in the city center. That's the best place. Hargan, who had already passed the 22nd floor, seemed to know the geography of this place quite well. Beach club, even Wu Yun had been there a few times. It was a place famous for its good taste on the 22nd floor, famous for its coffee. Wu Yun, who had washed up, headed straight to the promised place. Hargan was already waiting on the terrace outside, having ordered a car. Are you here? Wu Yun's coffee, which looked like a car, was steaming hot. On the other hand, Hargan's car was lukewarm and almost empty. Wu Yun sat across from Hargan and asked, when have you been here? A little while. Why alone in advance? Nothing to do, and a change of mood. Hargan said so, took out a cigarette from his arms and took a sip. A thick cigarette. It was the first time I saw it. Did you smoke it originally? I smoked it. I only do 1 or 2 a year. Why now? I thought of it. Talk, Chijijik. As Hargan flicked his finger, a fire ignited at the end of the cigar. Thick smoke billowed out. Hargan awkwardly exhaled the cigarette smoke he had gathered in his mouth. How high did you go? Me, 34th floor. You're fast. This is the problem from here. It's getting harder to climb. He joked, but 34th floor was already an incredible speed. Perhaps none of the high rankers in history have climbed the tower at this speed. If you're humble, you'll be unlucky. I'm not particularly humble. I'm not good at it. And is that something that comes out of your mouth? Yes, it was a silly story. Wu Yun took a sip of coffee to clear his mind and asked. But what's going on down here? It doesn't seem like you're here to see my face. Did you take the stone of the sea? Wu Yun nodded his head. It was a story already known to those who knew. Especially for players with a considerable position in Olympus, such as Hargan, it was impossible not to know. So there is no need to deny or hide it. You may not know it, but thanks to that, Olympus is a mess. A mess? The relationship between my father and my uncle is broken. Thanks to that, the atmosphere is confusing these days. He spoke jokingly, but it was by no means a light story. Father and uncle mentioned by Hargan. Zeus and Poseidon, the two were beings with the power and authority to shake this tower. The fact that the relationship between the two is divided is nothing less than an omen that great chaos can occur in the tower. Well, thanks to that, you'll be safe for now. But that's only for a while. I know, you can really die. Wu Yun put down the teacup he was holding at Hargan's words. Hargan continued, choose now. Bow your head to Olympus with a stone, or find a place that can protect you, like Asgard or heaven. Is it over? What? If you're done talking, I should get up. It's not a good thing to hear. That's not it. Hargan scratched his head at Wu Yun's firm response and asked nervously. Hey, are you really going to go all the way? It seems like I've said the same thing several times. Are you sure about that now? If I hadn't decided, I wouldn't have said this. It wasn't a wrong statement, though it was a grumbling tone. In the first place, even if Hargan had a connection with Wu Yun, Hargan's position within Olympus was bound to shake. He has made up his mind to stand completely on the opposite side of Zeus. 25th floor. Wu Yun's eyebrows twitched. Again, be especially careful of Britain's heart among them. Once again, Britain was mentioned. That's a huge trap to catch you.